Hey friends, about 70% of folks watching my videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a like, leave a comment, and let me know where you're tuning in from. I never imagined I'd end up as a park ranger patrolling remote wilderness areas facing unknown dangers, but here I am, Ethan Matthews. Originally from the suburbs of Philadelphia, growing up I was your typical city kid, more interested in video games than the great outdoors, but I always had a curiosity about the natural world. In school, science was my favorite subject. I watched documentaries about wildlife in faraway places, something in me longed to explore. After high school, unsure what to do with my life, I bounced around to different jobs, retail, food service, manual labor. Nothing felt right. I was dissatisfied, yearning for more adventure, more purpose. And to be frank, I needed money. Student loans, credit card debt, and the high cost of living were drowning me. That's when I saw the job posting that would change everything. Park ranger wanted for remote wilderness areas, must be willing to work in isolated locations for extended periods, survival and first aid skills a plus. Something about it called to me, a chance to escape the grind of everyday life, to challenge myself in a totally new environment, and the pay, while modest, would help dig me out of debt. I applied immediately. To my surprise, I got an interview, then an offer, contingent on completing months of intensive training, orienting wildlife identification, search and rescue, emergency medicine. It was physically and mentally draining, but I was determined, and gradually the soft city boy began transforming into someone new. Still me, but changed, tougher, more capable and confident. Before I knew it, I was packing up my old sedan and pointing it toward my first assignment, a vast state forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, boreal woodland stretching endlessly in all directions. The nearest town was an hour away, just a sleepy hamlet with one general store. My base was a small cabin with a wood stove and generator, miles from anything resembling civilization. Those first few months were challenging, as I learned the practicalities of living in the backwoods, rationing fuel for the generator, treating water from the creek to make it potable, maintaining an array of gear in all weather conditions. But I also discovered a peace in the solitude and self-reliance. It felt good to be exploring the hidden corners of the wild, keeping watch over this tract of pristine forest. There were occasional incidents, as expected, to help injured hikers, campfires left burning, and even a bear entering an occupied campsite. Nothing I couldn't handle. Overall, life was simple and quiet. I thought I was settling into my new role. Little did I know that I was about to face something that would shake me to my core. A mystery from the deepest shadows of these ancient woods where folklore and reality intertwined. It started small, with reports trickling in from campers about strange sounds at night, whispers on the wind, almost like voices coming from the darkest groves of old-growth timber. I didn't think much of it at first. Wild animals can make an astonishing array of noises, and sounds can play tricks when muffled by dense forest. It was likely coyotes yipping and howling, or branches creaking and knocking together in the breeze. The woods have a way of spooking people, especially city folk unaccustomed to being far from civilization. Imaginations run wild. I'd seen it before. So I made a mental note, but remained focused on my usual duties, trail maintenance and visitor assistance. But the reports kept coming and intensified. Campers claimed the eerie voices were drifting into camp from all directions, surrounding them. One swore the whispering followed him down the trail, darting between trees, always just out of sight. He said it sounded almost human, but not quite. The words were unintelligible. Then people began abandoning campsites in the middle of the night, hiking miles through the dark to the ranger station. Wide-eyed and jittery, they spoke of shadows slinking between the pines, too tall to be animals. of glimpsing pale figures in the undergrowth, and most unsettling of all, of seeing eyes saucer-wide and glinting with otherworldly luminescence peering out from the inky forest. And something was very wrong. This was beyond the occasional wildlife encounter or campers' jitters. A palpable sense of dread now hung over the forest. Even I had begun to feel it, the hairs on my neck prickling as I made my solitary patrols. I radioed the regional park office, reporting the disturbances and requesting backup. But help was distant in these isolated hinterlands. "You're the authority out there," my superintendent reminded me. "Trust your training, get to the bottom of this." So I began investigating in earnest, interviewing rattled campers, scouring the forest for signs of anything unusual. But the physical evidence was maddeningly scant. Snapped twigs, faint impressions in the loam that could be tracks or could be nothing. The whispering voices never revealed themselves to me directly. I pored over topographic maps and old records, trying to understand what could be happening. As I did, a chilling pattern emerged. I knew the incident centered near an area locals called the Whispering Grove, an old growth stand where logging crews a century ago had refused to cut timber, insisting the grove was haunted or cursed. Native legends I discovered told of the grove being a place where the barrier between worlds grew thin, where dark forces could slip through. But that was folklore myth, surely not connected to the here and now, or was it? I'm a rational man, but something was stalking these forests that defied explanation, and it was growing bolder, more aggressive. I had to act before something terrible occurred. A tipping point came on a misty autumn morning. I was jolted awake by the sound of screams echoing through the hazy half-light, primal shrieks of absolute terror resonating from somewhere out in the pines. I threw on clothes, my heart hammering against my sternum as I dashed out of the cabin into the pale dawn. Pausing briefly to listen, I pinpointed the direction of the screams and took off in a run, crashing through the dewy underbrush toward their source. The wails grew louder, more desperate. As I neared a campsite about a half-mile from the ranger station, I burst into the clearing, ready to confront any threat, adrenaline surging through my veins. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks. A woman, a camper I recognized from the day before, was on her knees in the center of the site, hands upraised imploringly to the heavens, rocking back and forth, keening like a lost soul. "My son," she cried in anguish. "It took my son." My eyes darted around the campsite and surrounding forest, scanning for any sign of the boy or the threat. But other than the woman's hysteria, all was still silent. The mist coiled lazily among the pines, draping everything in an otherworldly haze. I approached the woman cautiously, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Ma'am, I'm Ranger Matthews. I'm here to help." "What happened to your son?" She turned to me, her eyes wild with panic and tears streaming down her face. The whispers, she choked out between sobs. "They came all night, surrounding our tent, calling to him." He walked out into the woods, following them. I tried to stop him, but something held me back, wouldn't let me follow. She dissolved into incomprehensible anguish again, her body racked by shudders of grief. I felt a chill run up my spine that had nothing to do with the morning's damp chill. The whispers, the same eerie phenomenon so many campers had reported. But it had never targeted a child before, never lured anyone away. I called on the disappearance to the park headquarters and local authorities, urging them to send all available personnel for a search. But I already felt the gnawing dread, the grim understanding in my marrow that we were up against something beyond the scope of a normal missing persons case. As more rangers and volunteers arrived to comb the vast wilderness for the lost child, I turned my focus to the dark heart of the mystery, the Whispering Grove. If answers existed, they would be there among those ancient, brooding trees that had stood sentinel since long before human memory. I girded myself, checking and double-checking my gear. Compass, maps, radio, first aid kit. survival rations, and though I'd never carried one before, I slid the cold steel of a holstered pistol onto my belt. A part of me questioned what good it would do against the uncanny forces at work here, but its weight was a comfort nonetheless. With a deep breath, I struck off into the misty forest, toward the whispers and shadows and the unknown, determined to find the lost boy, to solve the dark riddle of these woods, even if it meant descending into a nightmare born of primordial folklore and deepest fear. The Whispering Grove loomed ahead of me, a dark smudge against the mist-shrouded forest. As I stepped beneath the ancient sentinel pines, I felt the air grow heavy, oppressive as if the oxygen itself were laced with foreboding. I'd been in old-growth forests before, marveled at the primal beauty of trees that had endured for centuries. But there was something different about this place. The trunks were like gnarled hands reaching up from the loam, their hoary bark etched with what looked uncomfortably like pained faces. The air didn't smell of pine and earth, but of moss and fungus and ancient decay. My every instinct screamed to turn back, that no lost child could have survived in this haunted wood. But I had a duty, an obligation to pursue every possibility, and the memory of the mother's wails still echoed in my heart. I followed the compass needle and topographic map toward the center of the grove, eyes straining for any sign of recent human passage. A scrap of cloth snagged on a branch, a footprint in the damp earth, a broken twig. But the forest kept its secrets, the omnipresent mist smearing shapes into amorphous shadows. As I pressed deeper, an unnatural twilight fell beneath the interwoven boughs, forcing me to click on my flashlight, though my watch said it was midday. The weight of unseen eyes pressed in from all sides. The scrutiny of ancient things roused from long slumber. Then I heard it, the whispering, sibilant consonants and atonal vowels slithering through the gloom, riding the currents of mist darting between the trees in a dizzying cacophony. I couldn't make out words, but the utterances crawled down my spine like bony fingers. I spun, sweeping my flashlight beam in the direction of the nearest voice. The light caught a flash of pale movement, but when I focused on the spot, only gnarled trunks and dripping leaves met my eyes. The whispers intensified, echoing from every direction, now mocking, entreating, beckoning, as though the forest itself was speaking in a language just beyond human comprehension. My heart raced as my head swiveled, trying in vain to pinpoint the source. Then through the discordant chorus I heard another sound, faint but distinct, a child's whimpering coming from somewhere ahead. In the clinging mist I surged forward, shouting into the haze, "Hello, I'm a ranger, I'm here to help." The otherworldly whispers crescendoed, angry and insistent. But I was focused solely on the small human sound. I crashed through the underbrush in its direction, thorns tearing at my uniform, branches slapping my face. The child's cries grew louder as I neared the heart of the grove. I burst into a small clearing, and there, huddled against the base of an enormous twisted oak, was the missing boy. Relief surged through me. I ran to his side, checking him for injury. He was cold, disoriented, weeping but breathing, and seemingly unharmed. "It's okay," I said, gathering him into my arms. "I've got you." But as I rose to leave this evil place, the boy clutched my sleeve with terror, his eyes wide with fear, a keening cry building in his throat. I followed his gaze upward, and the mist was parting above us, revealing the hoary branches of the oak tree. Perched there, crouched like a gargoyle, like on the limbs were things, emaciated, pale forms, vaguely human in shape but horribly elongated. Stick-thin limbs, swollen joints, faces little more than gaping mouths filled with needle teeth and cavernous eye sockets that glowed with cold fire. It hissed down at me as the boy shrieked. I stumbled backward with the child, groping for my pistol with my free hand. The horrors tense, preparing to drop upon us, their claws flexed ancient hunger. In their gaze, time seemed to flow like cold honey. As my hand closed out of the grip of my gun, I yanked it from the holster, raised it in trembling hands, and fired. The fierce abomination leapt, pale limbs unfolding like a murderous spider. I saw my death reflected in its glowing eye sockets. I squeezed the trigger, the gunshot shattered the gloaming beneath the whispering boughs. The leaping horrors had snapped back in a spray of black ichor as the bullet found its mark and crumpled to the loam in a tangle of pale limbs oozing dark fluids. But there was no time for relief or revulsion. Its companions hissed in fury and launched themselves from the branches, a pale wave of gnashing teeth and outstretched claws. I fired again and again, each shot thundering through the grove, felling another of the abominations. And yet they still came. A tide of writhing, grasping horrors born of primordial nightmares. For each one cut down by my desperate fuselage, two more emerged from the mist-cloaked boughs. My pistol clicked empty as clammy, gnarled hands closed around my ankles. With a cry, I yanked the sobbing child close and kicked out desperately, feeling my boots sink into yielding, putrid flesh. I staggered back, swinging the empty gun like a club, the steel cracking against those horrible eyeless skulls. It was a losing battle, and I knew it. There were too many and endless legion birthed by this unholy forest. Even as I battered them back, I could feel my strength ebbing, each swing slower than the last. The boy's weight seemed to double and redouble in my arms. So this was how it would end, torn apart in this forsaken place. Just another mystery that the forest swallowed whole. My only solace was that I'd found the child, that perhaps I had brought him a few more precious moments of life. As the first talons sank into my flesh and I fell to my knees, that much flashed unbidden through my mind. The topographic map I'd consulted, the one showing the terrain of the Whispering Grove, the bizarre symbols sketched around its heart, which I'd taken for surveying marks. They danced before my eyes, now burning with eldritch fire. With my last strength, I snatched the map from my breast pocket, the blood-stained paper crumpling in my fists. The horrors paused, pale faces swiveling toward it, their eternal gloaming eyes wide. I had no inkling why, no time to question. With a roar of defiance and desperation, I thrust the map into the reaching claws, shoving it against those lamprey mouths. The result was instantaneous and explosive. The abominations recoiled as if scalded, their shrieks of hunger becoming wails of agony. Smoke coiled from where the paper touched their marbled skin, the strange symbols flared white-hot. We released their hold and skittered back into the shadows, vast forms receding into the fog-shredded trees. The boy and I crouched there in the blood-spattered loam, our chests heaving as our minds struggled to process the sudden turn. The map, or whatever power it contained, had driven them back, weakened them somehow. But not for long, I suspected. Already the mist roiled angrily between the mossy trunks, the whispers rising in pitch and volume. Pale shapes slunk at the edges of sight, malevolent and hungry. I snatched up the boy and ran, crashing through the grasping undergrowth toward the edge of the grove. Thorny branches clawed at me, roots rose to trip my flying feet. The desperation drove me, lent wings to my heels. At last we burst from beneath the foreboding canopy back into the honest light of day. The whispers receded behind us like a fell tide, but their menace lingered, promising retribution. There would be a reckoning. I knew for my trespass in that Blackheart wood, for the rescued child in my arms. The horrors would not soon forget this insult, this thwarting of their ancient hunger. They would come for us and slip from that foul grove to enact vengeance in the dead of night. But those were troubles for another time. In that moment, as the honest sun beat down upon us and the boy sobbed gently into my torn uniform, I could only feel relief and deliverance. We had emerged from the Whispering Grove alive, if not unscathed. I carried the child out of the forest, murmuring reassurances. Scarcely believing myself, his mother's cries of joy as I handed him into her trembling arms were the only balm I needed for my battered soul. But even as the tearful reunion unfolded, I couldn't shake the sense of dread coiled around my heart. I had seen beyond the veil, glimpsed the horrors lurking in the shadows of our world, and in doing so, I had drawn their ire. In the days that followed, I tried to lose myself in the routine of my duties, checking trails, assisting campers, filing reports. But my heart was no longer in it. Each rustle of leaves, each shadow between the pines set my nerves to jangling. Sleep became a rare luxury, my nights haunted by visions of pale flesh and clouded eyes. And always at the edges of slumber, the sibilant whispers crawled. I took to studying the map in my off hours, poring over those strange symbols that had driven the horrors back. The ink seemed to writhe on the parchment, forming sigils that made my eyes ache. There was power there, primal and ancient, but wielding it, if I even could, felt akin to clutching a double-edged blade. Still, I memorized each eldritch curve and line, carved them into the stock of my pistol, the leather of my boots, stitched them into the brim of my hat. If the abominations came for me, I would not be defenseless. A week passed, then two. I began to wonder if the denizens of the Whispering Grove had forgotten me, if I had imagined the promise of retribution in those simian skulls. Perhaps they had slumped back to the pit that spawned them to slumber another epic. I should have known better, should have trusted that first warning. A prickle along my scalp, that primordial dread that had kept our ancestors alive in the night-black forests of Eld. It happened on a moonless night, the forest cloaked in impenetrable shadow. I sat in my cabin oiling my pistol when a scream pierced the dark, but not a human cry, something throatier, more visceral, an animal-like shriek. I was at the door in an instant, flashlight in hand, unholstered gun gleaming with forbidden sigils. I swept the beam across the tree line, heart pounding against my ribs. The cry had come from nearby, just within the forest's edge. Swallowing hard, I ventured into the woods, each step leaden with dread. The darkness pressed in, suffocatingly alive. My flashlight seemed a feeble, sputtering candle against that unreasoning black. And then the beam fell upon it, a splash of red against the loam, a disemboweled deer, its glazed eyes staring accusingly into eternity. Viscera steamed in the chill air, ribs jutting like pale fingers. But it was what crouched over the carcass that froze the blood of my veins. That same pallid flesh, those lambent eyes and grasping claws. It was one of them, the Whispering Grove's horrors. Here now, beyond the confines of that eldritch wood, it swiveled its eyeless face toward me, a blood-stained grin splitting its skull. And as it rose to its full, terrible height, I heard them, the whispers emanating from every shadow, crooning my name like a lover's call. I wish I could say I stood my ground, that I stared defiantly into those pits of ancient hunger we would call eyes and made my stand as a man should. But before my quailing heart, primordial dread took hold, the instinctive terror of prey before predator that had kept our forebears alive in a savage world. I ran through the undergrowth back toward the thin bulwark of my cabin. Dull composure, forgotten branches slapped my face, tore at my clothes still, and ran a mad dash for fragile safety. And as I ran, the whispers chased me, insidious and gleeful, ululating from every shadow, riding the wind's midnight fingers. Their rods were indistinct, but their intent was clear. Mocking, savoring the cruel amusement of a cat toying with a doomed mouse. I hit the cabin door at a dead run, shouldering through and slamming it behind me. Fingers fumbling, I slid the bolt home. A pitiful defense against the horrors of the Whispering Grove. My pulse roared in my ears, frantic breath sawing from my lungs. I backed away, pistol clutched in a white-knuckled grip, eyes wide in the gloom. I expected the door to shatter inward at any moment, spilling those abominations into my last sanctuary. The whispers danced outside the walls, insectile feet skittering across the logs, claws raked the shutters, a furtive scratching that set my teeth on edge. The door held. The horrors could not cross that threshold. It made no sense. If they could round the forest now, what was stopping them from laying siege to my cabin, breaking in and glutting their twisted hunger? My gaze fell upon the symbols I had carved into the doorframe, the eldritch sigils copied from that impossible map. They seemed to glow softly in the darkness, pulsing in time to some unknowable rhythm. Of course, the map, the strange power it held over the creatures of the grove, those markings warded my cabin, kept the shadows at bay. But for how long? How long before they deciphered this ancient language, found the key to unravel my desperate defenses? I sank to the floor, back pressed against the rough-hewn wall. The adrenaline that had sustained my flight drained away, leaving me wrung out. Hopelessness crashed over me in a black wave. What was I to do? Cower here forever, jumping at every scratch and whisper, try to escape. Make a break for civilization and pray the horrors didn't drag me down. And even if I did by some miracle make it out. And what? Lose some hapless fool to take up my post, unwitting of the nightmare lurking in the depths of the forest? No, I knew with grim certainty that there would be no running from this, no escape. The Whispering Grove had marked me, claimed me, and to what have its due, I took a deep, shuddering breath, drew on reserves of courage I didn't know I had. There was only one path forward, one chance for survival. I had to take the fight to them, had to venture back into that foul briar, confront the source of this ancient evil, put an end to the whispers and shadows, whatever the cost. I checked my gun, the sigils dancing along the barrel, gathered what meager supplies I had, rations, water, first aid kit. Under my uniform, the fabric heavy with the weight of duty. As I laid my hand on the doorknob, the whispers outside reached a fever pitch. Howls of anticipation, of hunger. Too long denied, I steadied myself, fixing the coordinates of the Whispering Grove in my mind. Then, with a whispered prayer to any gods that might be listening, I opened the door and stepped out into the nightmare darkness of the forest. The night enveloped me like a living thing, clammy and up. The whispers surged around me in a maelstrom, spectral fingers clawing at my sanity. But I pushed forward, one leaden step at a time, my course unwavering. I could feel them out there in the darkness, watching pale shapes flitting between the trees, lambent eyes flickering at the undergrowth. They shadowed my every move, a twisted escort to the heart of their domain. The journey to the Whispering Grove seemed to take an eternity. Each yard felt like a hellish mile. But at last I breached that fell boundary and stepped beneath those ancient grasping boughs. The whispering ceased. Silence crashed down as deep and suffocating as the abyss. Even the nightbirds and insects stilled their voices as if in deference to some greater predator. I walked on, falling leaves crunching beneath my boots. The deformity of the trees grew more pronounced as I pushed inward, boles warped into grotesque shapes, branches gnarled into clutching claws. The air hung thick and fetid, heavy with the stench of decay. As I neared the clearing, I saw a figure step from behind a monstrous oak. I raised my gun, eldritch sigils glowing, but paused when I saw it was no abomination. A man as ancient and twisted as the grove itself. Skin like cracked parchment stretched over a skeletal frame, wispy hair white as bone. He was clad in moldering rags, more shadow than substance. His eyes, though, were alive, blazing with a phalite flickering between eldritch green and corpse candle blue. When he spoke, his voice was the rustle of dead leaves, the scraping of coffin lids. "So you've come," he rasped, cracked lips peeling back from rotten teeth. "Foolish boy, stupid brave boy." I leveled my gun, the symbols burning cold against my palm. "Who are you?" I demanded, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. The old man cackled, a sound like snapping twigs. "Me, I'm the keeper of this place, the guardian of the gates. Long ago I was called other things, but names have little meaning here. He fixed me with that lambent stare, seemed to see right through to the marrow of my being. You took something from us, boy, stole it away like a thief in the night. The child, I said, my mouth dry as old bones. He didn't belong to you, to this place. Belong. The keeper shook his head, dust sifting from his hair. Belong is for hearth and home, for daylight things. The child was marked, chosen. His blood sings the old song, the song of the wood. We merely answered its call. I shook my head vehemently, even as dread coiled in my gut. No, I won't let you take him, won't let you drag anyone else into this nightmare. The old man's smile widened an abyss, yawning. My boy, what makes you think you have a choice? The whispers rose like a tide, filling the clearing with their sibilant chorus. The keeper's form shivered, blood split into a dozen shifting shadows. From each writhing shape, pale flesh and grasping claws emerged. I fired into that squirming mass. Eldritch-etched slugs punched through putrid flesh. Shrieks pierced the night. Black ichors splashed the loam. But for each abomination I cut down, two more clawed forth from the keeper's shadow. They came at me in a chittering wave, lampering mouths, ungodly pits of eyes burning with cold fire. I emptied my gun, swung it like a club. The sigils flared as they connected with twisted flesh. But it wasn't enough. Could never be enough. This was their place, their source. The whispering grove had stood for eons and would stand long after my bones crumbled to dust. Claws raked my flesh, teeth punctured skin and sinew. I fell beneath that pale tide, the last of my strength spent. As the darkness took me, the keeper's voice slithered through my fading thoughts. Brave, foolish boy, did you think to stand against the wood, against the ancient song? In the shadows, I could only gurgle wetly in response, my lifeblood pooling beneath me. The abominations chittered in triumph, their eager hands grasping, pulling, tearing. And as the last guttering flame of consciousness fled, the whispers rose to a deafening howl, a paean to the eternal wood, the undying shadow beneath the world. Those younger people would always tell me that I had my grandfather's spirit, a calm, methodical man who could stay steady in the midst of chaos. My name is Taiyu Warfield, and I've spent most of my life on the Quenowell Reservation, nestled deep in the temperate rainforests of Washington. We have a way of life here that feels ancient and rooted, passed down through generations who have called these misty forests home. I've worked as a park ranger for the Credo Indian Nation for the last decade. My job, in theory, is simple: maintain the forests, keep the visitors safe, and respect the spirits that call the forest home. Most days are uneventful, spent patrolling well-worn trails, checking in on campsites, and occasionally helping a lost hiker find their way back. The tranquility suits me just fine. I find peace in the routine, in the soft crunch of leaves and pine needles beneath my boots, in the gentle whisper of the wind through the towering evergreens. Every once in a while, something happens out here that I can't explain. Something that doesn't feel right, that raises the hair on the back of my neck and sends a chill down my spine despite the temperate air. I don't talk about it much, even with other rangers. There's an unspoken understanding among us that the forest holds secrets, that there are things out here that defy rational explanation. We respect the mysteries, give them a wide berth. My uncle, a man of few words but deep wisdom, once told me the forest here is like a living thing, always watching, always listening. He never liked to go into the deeper woods, past the old logging road where the trees grow impossibly tall and the ground turns into a thick carpet of moss and ferns. The locals call that area the uncharted land, not because it's physically unexplored, but because it belongs to something else, something ancient and not entirely of this world. Growing up, I was always curious about the uncharted land, drawn to it in a way I couldn't quite explain, but I also respected the boundaries, the warnings passed down through generations. At least I did until this past summer when the disappearances started and everything changed. The first to go missing was a tourist, a young woman from out of state, who had set off on a solo hike. She was supposed to check in at the ranger station after her trek, but she never showed. It wasn't until 3 days later that I found her car still parked at the trailhead, covered in a fine layer of mist and fallen leaves. The search teams combed the area for a week, scouring every trail, every ravine, every dense thicket of underbrush, but they found no trace of her. It was as if she had simply vanished, swallowed whole by the vast expanse of green. The unsettling thing wasn't just that she disappeared. People get lost in the woods. It happens to her as the totality of her absence, the complete lack of any clues or sign of her fate. No discarded gear, no footprints, nothing, just an eerie, all-consuming silence that seemed to emanate from the heart of the forest itself. At first we told ourselves it was an isolated incident, a tragic but explainable event. But then a month later it happened again. This time it was one of our own, a local man named Warren Lonetree, who had been hunting these woods since he was old enough to hold a rifle. Warren knew the forest like the lines of his own weathered hands. He would never just get lost, but lost he was vanished without a trace. All we found was his hunting dog, whimpering and shivering near the old logging road, a place Warren never would have ventured on a hunt. That was the first sign that something was truly amiss, a clue that these disappearances were more than mere coincidence. I began to keep a closer eye on that stretch of forest after Warren went missing, venturing deeper into the somber woods than I normally would, past the invisible boundary that separated the tamed from the wild. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I could feel it in my bones that something wasn't right. The way the mist clung low to the ground, even on clear days, the heavy silence that hung in the air, broken only by the occasional skitter of an unseen animal in the underbrush, the prickling sensation of being watched, of being weighed and measured by unseen eyes. I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the old stories were more than mere legends. If there was some truth to the tales of spirits and creatures that roamed the deep woods, ancient beings that didn't take kindly to trespassers in their domain. I had always been a rational man, grounded in the tangible world, but out there in the uncharted land, rationality seemed to hold less sway, giving ground to something older, something that defied easy explanation. Still, I had a job to do. I couldn't let fear or superstition keep me from my duties, and so I kept patrolling, kept searching, even as the weight of the forest's secrets seemed to press in closer with each passing day. Little did I know that I was about to come face to face with the truth behind the disappearances, and that the truth would be far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The third disappearance happened in late August, when the summer heat had started to give way to the crisp whisper of fall. A camper named Joe Conklin, a regular visitor to our neck of the woods, had gone off-grid for a few days to enjoy the solitude of the deep forest. It wasn't unusual for Joe. He was an experienced outdoorsman who often sought out the less traveled paths, the quiet places where he could breathe in the pine-scented air and let the burble distant streams wash away the stress of the modern world. But this time something was different. Joe's wife called in, worried sick after he failed to check in as planned. It was a small thing, an easily missed phone call, but in the context of previous disappearances, it set off alarm bells in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that Joe hadn't just lost track of time out there in the wilderness, that he wasn't just enjoying an extra day or two of solitude. No, my gut told me that Joe was in trouble, that he had stumbled into something beyond his understanding, beyond anyone's understanding, and my gut was rarely wrong about these things. I set out to search for him, tracing the route he had planned to take, a winding path that snaked deep into uncharted land. As I hiked, I couldn't help but notice the changes in the forest around me, the way the trees seemed to close their branches, intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The way the underbrush grew thicker, more tangled, as if it were actively trying to impede my progress. And then there was the silence, the deep, impenetrable quiet that seemed to swallow even the sound of my own footsteps. It was unnatural, that silence. In a healthy forest, there's always noise, the chitter of squirrels, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant calls of birds. But out there in the heart of the uncharted land, there was nothing, just a heavy, oppressive absence of sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I kept hiking, pushing through the clinging underbrush, scanning the ground for any sign of Joe's passing. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded bits of gear. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air, just like the others. As the day wore on and the shadows grew long, I started to get the feeling that I was being watched. It was a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a subtle awareness of eyes on me from the depths of the forest. I told myself it was just nerves, that the eeriness of the silent woods was getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that something out there had taken notice of me, that I had crossed some invisible threshold into a place where I didn't belong. I was just about to turn back, to retrace my steps back to the safety of the known trails, when I saw it. A flash of movement in the corner of my eye, a shape that seemed to melt into the shadows of the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, a play of shadow and imagination. But then I saw it again, clearer this time, and my blood ran cold. It was big, far larger than any animal I had ever seen in these woods, and it moved with a silent grace that was utterly unnatural, its form seeming to flow and shift with each step, blending with the dappled shadows of the forest floor. I caught a glimpse of shaggy fur, of long, spindly limbs that bent at odd angles, and then, for just a second, I saw its eyes, two pinpricks of pale milky white that seemed to glow in the gathering dusk. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run or flee back the way I had come, but something held me in place. A morbid fascination mixed with a bone-deep terror that turned my legs to jelly. The creature, whatever it was, stared at me from the shadows, unbunky and unmoving. And in that moment, I knew with a terrible certainty that I was looking at the thing responsible for the disappearances, the being that had claimed the uncharted land as its own. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that silent, terrifying standoff. It could have been seconds or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the presence of that abomination. But finally, mercifully, the creature turned and melted back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as it had come. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind reeling with what I had just seen. And now, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled energy, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that awful, silent watcher in the woods. I must have run for miles, driven by a primitive fear that overrode all sense of direction or reason. It wasn't until I stumbled out onto a familiar trail, gasping for breath and drenched in cold sweat, that I allowed myself to slow to try to process what had just happened. I knew with a grim certainty that Joe Conklin was gone, that the forest had claimed him just as it had claimed the others. And I knew that I could never unsee what I had witnessed out there in the uncharted land, that the memory of those pale, dead eyes would haunt me for the rest of my days. But I also knew that I couldn't keep this to myself, that I had a responsibility to warn others, to try to prevent more lives from being lost to the hungering woods. And so, with a heavy heart and a trembling hand, I reached for my radio and called it in, setting in motion a chain of events that would change the Kennelly Reservation forever. The next few days passed in a blur of activity and unease. I gave my report to the tribal council, trying my best to describe what I had seen out there in the uncharted land without sounding like a madman. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken skepticism. After all, what I was suggesting was the stuff of legend, old stories told around campfires to frighten children, creatures in the woods, ancient and malevolent. with the power to make people vanish without a trace. It was a hard pill to swallow, even for those of us who had grown up steeped in the lore of the Kinele people. But they couldn't deny the facts of the disappearances, or the eerie similarity in how each person had vanished, and they couldn't ignore the fear that had started to take hold in the community, the whispers of something unnatural stalking the forests. In the end, they had no choice but to take my warning seriously, even if they weren't quite ready to believe in monsters. They sent out search parties larger and better equipped than before. They brought in dogs, tracking experts, even a few shamans to perform ancient rites of protection and cleansing. But it was all for naught. The forest yielded no clues, no trace of the missing. It was as if they had stepped off the edge of the world, vanished into a place beyond human understanding. As the days stretched into weeks and the search efforts dwindled, I found myself spending more and more time out of the woods, drawn back to the uncharted land like a moth to a flame. I told myself I was just doing my job, keeping an eye out for any sign of the missing. But deep down I knew there was more to it than that. I was searching for answers, for some way to make sense of the impossible things I had seen. And by being honest, there was a part of me that wanted to see it again. The creature from the shadows, the silent watcher in the wood. I know how crazy that sounds, believe me, but there's something about coming face to face with the unknown, with something that defies all logical explanation. It changes you, marks you in some fundamental way, and as much as the memory of those dead milky eyes filled me with terror, it also sparked a dark fascination, a need to understand. So I kept patrolling, venturing deeper and deeper into the uncharted land, always alert for any sign of the creature's presence. And as I did, I started to notice changes in the forest itself, the way the mist seemed to cling and swirl even on clear days, the way the trees seemed to shift and rustle without any wind. It was as if the very landscape was responding to the creature's presence, warping itself to fit its unfathomable nature. I wasn't the only one who noticed the strangeness. The other rangers, the ones who ventured out into the deep woods, started to bring back their own stories, tales of strange sounds in the night of shadows that moved with a life of their own. Some even claimed to have caught glimpses of the creature itself, fleeting and indistinct, but terrifying all the same. We started to call it the Forest Guardian, for lack of a better name. It seemed fitting in a dark, twisted sort of way. After all, what else could you call a being that seemed to hold dominion over the very trees and soil that could make people vanish without a trace? As the story spread, so too did the fear. People started avoiding the woods, sticking to well-worn trails and campgrounds. Some even left the reservation altogether, seeking safety in the outside world. But for those of us who stayed, who called the Quinoa lands home, there was no escaping the reality of what lurked in the uncharted land. It all came to a head late one autumn night, when a young couple failed to return from a camping trip near the old logging road. The search parties found their tent ripped to shreds and stained with blood, but of the couple themselves there was no sign. It was the final straw, the tipping point that pushed the tribal council to take drastic action. They declared the uncharted land off limits, forbidding anyone from venturing past the old boundaries. They even went so far as to bring in outside help, government agents and paranormal investigators desperate for any aid in understanding the nature of the threat. But I knew deep in my bones that no amount of restrictions or outside intervention would change the truth of what lived in those woods. The Forest Guardian, whatever it was, had been there long before us. It would be there long after we were just passing through its domain. Brief flickers of life in an ancient, unfathomable darkness. And yet, despite the danger, despite the ever-present fear, I couldn't bring myself to leave, to turn my back on the mystery of the uncharted land. It had gotten under my skin and deep into my soul. I was bound to this place, to the secrets it held, in a way I couldn't fully explain even to myself. And so I stayed, watching and waiting, a lone sentinel on the border between the known and the unknown, waiting for the day when the Forest Guardian would reveal itself again. when I would finally come face to face with the truth behind the disappearances, no matter how terrible that truth might be. Winter came early that year, blanketing the quinoa lands in a thick layer of snow and ice. The reservation took on a hushed, eerie quality. The forest transformed into a stark landscape of skeletal trees and endless white. It was a time of hibernation, of hunkering down and waiting out the long, cold months. But for me, there was no respite from the gnawing questions that haunted my every waking moment. I continued my patrols, bundled up against the biting chill, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The uncharted land was even more treacherous in winter, with deep snow concealing hidden obstacles and icy streams. But I pushed on, driven by a compulsion I couldn't fully articulate, a need to confront the unknown that bordered on obsession. It was on one of these solitary treks that I made a discovery that would change everything. I was picking my way through a dense copse of snow-laden pines when I stumbled upon a clearing I had never seen before. It was perfectly circular, as if someone had taken a giant compass and carved out a neat wedge of forest. But it wasn't the shape of the clearing that made my heart stop in my chest. It was what lay at its center. It was a structure, ancient and weathered, that seemed to rise up from the very earth itself. At first glance, it appeared to be little more than a jumble of stones piled haphazardly atop one another. But as I drew closer, picking my way carefully through the snow, I began to discern a pattern, a deliberate design that spoke of intelligence and purpose. The stones were arranged in concentric circles, each one smaller than the last, spiraling inward towards a central point. At the very heart of the structure, a single pillar of black rock thrust up towards the sky, its surface carved with intricate symbols and glyphs that seemed to writhe and dance in the pale winter light. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold as I stared at the ancient edifice. There was something unsettling about it, something that seemed to emanate a palpable sense of wrongness. It was as if the very stones were imbued with a malevolent energy, a dark and twisted power that set my teeth on edge and made my skin crawl. But even as every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee this place and never return, I found myself drawn forward, pulled toward the center of the spiral by a force I couldn't resist. It was as if the structure itself was calling to me, whispering secrets in a language I could almost, but not quite understand. As I reached the base of the central pillar, I saw that the symbols carved into its surface were not mere decorations, but a form of writing, a script unlike anything I had ever seen before. The characters seemed to shift and change before my eyes, flowing into one another in a dizzying dance of meaning. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers hovering just above the cold black stone. And then, with a sudden sickening lurch, the world around me fell away and I was plunged into a vision of such horror and madness that I could hardly comprehend what I was seeing. I saw the forest guardian in its true form, a thing of nightmare and shadow, ancient beyond reckoning. I saw the uncharted land as it truly was, a place where the very fabric of reality was thin and stretched, where the laws of nature held no sway. And I saw the fate of those who had vanished, the terrible price they had paid for trespassing in a domain that was not meant for mortal eyes. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in the grip of that awful vision. It could have been seconds or hours. Time seemed to have no meaning in that place of darkness and revelation, but finally, mercifully, the vision released me and I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my mind reeling with the weight of what I had seen. I knew with a terrible certainty that the structure in the clearing was the key to understanding the mystery of the uncharted land, that it held the answers I had been seeking for so long. But I also knew that such knowledge would come at a terrible price, that to delve too deeply into the secrets of that place would be to court madness and destruction. With a shaking hand, I reached for my camera, determined to document my discovery, to bring back proof of the impossible things I had seen. But as I raised the viewfinder to my eye, I hesitated, struck by a sudden awful realization. The forest guardian knew I was here. He had shown me these things for a reason, had drawn me to this place of power and secrets, and now, having given me a glimpse of the truth, it would never let me leave. Never allow me to share what I had learned with the outside world. I was trapped, snared in a web of ancient magic and eldritch horror, a pawn in a game whose rules I could barely comprehend. And as I stood there, frozen in terror and despair, I mocked with grim certainty that my fate was sealed, that I would never escape the uncharted land, never be free of the dark and twisted power that held sway over that place. For I had seen the truth behind the disappearances, had glimpsed the terrible reality that lurked beneath the surface of the world. I thought I knew, and in that moment of revelation I understood at last the price of knowledge, the terrible burden of understanding. I was lost, adrift in a sea of shadows and secrets, a wanderer in a land where no mortal was meant to tread. And as the forest guardian watched from the depths of the darkening woods, and that my journey had only just begun, that the true horror of the uncharted land was yet to be revealed. In the days that followed my discovery of the ancient structure in the woods, I became a man possessed, driven by a desperate need to unravel the secrets of the uncharted land. I pored over old maps and documents, seeking any clue, any scrap of information that might shed light on the dark history of that place. I learned of ancient legends, whispered stories passed down through generations of the Konoe people, tales of a time before time when strange and terrible beings walked the earth, wielding powers beyond human understanding. They spoke of a great battle, a war between the forces of light and darkness that had raged across the very fabric of reality, and at the center of it all, the ancient structure in the woods. A place of power and sacrifice, where the boundary between worlds was thin and the veil of reality could be pierced by those with the knowledge and the will. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that the Forest Guardian was no mere beast, no simple predator stalking the woods. It was a manifestation of something far older and more powerful, a being that had been worshipped and feared by the ancient peoples of this land. And the disappearances, the terrible fate of those who had vanished in the uncharted land, they were offerings, sacrifices made to appease the Guardian, to keep its wrath at bay and maintain the delicate balance between the worlds. I knew that I was treading on dangerous ground, that to delve too deeply into the mysteries of the uncharted land was to risk my very sanity. But I could not turn back, could not ignore the terrible knowledge that burned in my mind. And so I returned to the woods, to the place of the ancient structure, determined to confront the Forest Guardian and unravel the final secrets of that dark and twisted place. I will not speak of what happened there, in that clearing of stone and shadow. The memories are too painful, too raw and bleeding to be put into words. Suffice it to say that I looked upon the face of true horror, that I witnessed things that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. In the end I escaped, if what I endure now can be called an escape. I fled the uncharted land, my mind shattered, my soul forever marked by the taint of that place. I left behind the Kenole Reservation, the only home I had ever known, driven by a need to put as much distance as possible between myself and the dark truths I had uncovered. But even now, in the neon-soaked streets of the city, in the bustle and clamor of the modern world, I cannot escape the shadow of the Forest Guardian. It haunts my dreams, lurks in the corners of my vision, a constant reminder of the terrible price I paid for my knowledge. And I know with a grim certainty that my story is not over, that the uncharted land is not finished with me yet. For I have seen the truth that lies beneath the surface of the world, have glimpsed the dark and primal forces that lurk in the spaces between. I am a man marked, a wanderer in the borderlands of reality, forever seeking a way to escape the curse of my own understanding. But even as I run, even as I try to lose myself in the teeming anonymity of the city, I know that there is no true escape, no fleeing the terrible destiny that awaits me. For I am bound to the uncharted land, to the ancient powers that hold sway over that place of shadow and secrets. And one day I know I will be called back. drawn once again into the heart of the nightmare that has claimed me as its own. The forest guardian is waiting, watching from the depths of the darkening woods. And when the time comes, when the stars align and the veil between worlds grows thin, I will answer its call, will step once more into the realm of darkness and madness. For I am the keeper of the secret, the guardian of the terrible truth that lies at the heart of the uncharted land. And though it may cost me everything, though it may shatter my mind and consume my soul, I will not falter, will not turn away from the destiny that has been laid before me. I am Tyabi Warfield, and I have seen the face of true horror, and now there is no turning back, no escape from the dark and twisted path that I must walk. May whatever gods there be have mercy on my soul deep within the remote mountains of Montana. Nestled in a secluded valley, far from prying eyes, lies a place known only as Facility 9. To the outside world it doesn't exist, wiped from maps and records. But to those of us who work there, it's all too real. I'm Tom Cassidy, a geneticist who spent the last decade of my career toiling away in this secret government lab. We tinker with DNA like kids with a chemistry set, splicing genes and crafting chimeric creatures that defy nature's designs. Some are made to cure diseases. Others, I suspect, have far more sinister purposes in mind. My latest assignment is Project Cauldron, an initiative so classified that it and most of the facility staff are unaware of its existence. The goal is to engineer a new breed of biological weapon, not a virus or toxin, but a living, breathing predator. We call it Nemesis. To craft this ultimate hunter, we've been playing a dangerous game, combining human DNA with genetic material from nature's most lethal killers. Genes from lions granted raw strength and lightning-quick reflexes. Crocodile DNA provides armored scales and a vicious bite. Rattlesnake genes deliver toxic venom. The result is an apex predator never before seen on Earth. At first glance, Nemesis is a twisted abomination, a Frankenstein's monster of clashing animal traits. It stands on two powerful hind legs, towering over 7 feet tall. Sleek feline muscles ripple beneath crocodilian scales and leathery, bulletproof skin. The head is vaguely human, but stretched and deformed, with a distended jaw lined with jagged teeth. 6-inch talons adorn its hands and feet, gleaming like surgical steel. We keep the creature sequestered in a fortified containment cell, a high-tech cage of ballistic glass and reinforced titanium. Day and night it paces behind the transparent wall. Its smoldering eyes watch us coldly as we observe its behavior, test its capabilities. Despite its unnatural origins, Nemesis has demonstrated a keen intelligence that's both fascinating and unnerving. It solves complex puzzles with ease, recognizes patterns, even mimics sounds and words with its sinewy throat. But there's a malevolence in its gaze, an unpredictable savagery lurking beneath the surface. This is no mere animal, it's something else entirely. Many on the team have already voiced concerns, myself included. This isn't a creature to be controlled or tamed. We're like fleas trying to put a lion on a leash. It's only a matter of time until it turns on us. But my protests have fallen on deaf ears. As long as Project Cauldron keeps yielding results, the higher-ups don't want to hear about risks. To them, Nemesis is nothing more than a number on a spreadsheet, a prototype to be forged into a deadly weapon. They say it's for the good of the country. I say we're sowing the seeds of our own destruction. No cage can hold a monster forever. Sooner or later, it gets out. My greatest fear is that when Nemesis breaks free, we won't be able to stop it. God help us all when that happens. The attack happened on a Wednesday, and at least I think it was Wednesday. In a place like Facility 9, where the sun never shines and the fluorescent lights never dim, every day bleeds into the next time, loses all meaning. I was stationed in the observation room that morning, my face lit by the glow of a dozen monitors displaying various camera angles of Nemesis' containment cell. The creature was pacing as it so often did, its claws gouging deep scratches into the cement floor. Then the sirens began to wail. Crimson lights strobed across the control panels. I felt my blood run cold. Something had breached containment. At first, I thought it was just another drill, an exercise to keep us sharp and ready. But then I saw the flashing warnings on the security screens. The words I hoped I'd never have to read: containment failure. Nemesis was loose. Chaos erupted in the corridors outside. Panicked shouts and pounding feet echoed off the sterile white tiles. On the monitors, I watched in helpless horror as the guards assigned to Nemesis' cell rushed in to subdue the beast. Their assault rifles were leveled. They never stood a chance. The creature moved with a speed that defied belief. A blur of mottled scales and taut muscle, it lunged at the nearest guard, batting the gun from his hands with a swipe of its talons. A scream turned to a wet gurgle as those scythe-like claws ripped through Kevlar and flesh like parchment. The other guards opened fire. The staccato bark of gunshots joined the symphony of screams and roars. But the bullets only seemed to make Nemesis angrier. He wheeled on the remaining men, pouncing with feline grace. Gore splashed the walls as it tore them apart, painting the once immaculate chamber a glistening crimson. In the observation room, we could only watch, powerless, as it turned the containment wing into an abattoir. It was like seeing a lion savage, a pack of lambs, an unstoppable predator among helpless prey. With a trembling hand, I slammed my fist into the emergency lockdown button, sealing the bulkheads in a desperate bid to contain the carnage. But on my gut, I knew it was futile. The creature was too strong, too quick, too smart. It would find a way out. It was only a matter of time. As if on cue, an ominous boom shook the entire facility, the echoes rolling down the halls like peals of thunder. On the screens, I saw the heavy blast doors to the containment wing buckle and then give way, crumpling like tin foil. Through the twisted wreckage, a pair of glowing eyes flashed in the shadows. Nemesis was coming, and it was hungry. The next few minutes were a blur of primal terror and desperate survival instinct. With communications cut and the facility's layout warping into a labyrinth of identical corridors, all semblance of order crumbled. It was every man for himself. A frantic race for any possible exit as Nemesis rampaged through the complex. I bolted from the observation room, my heart slamming against my ribs. As I pelted down the hallway, the screams of my colleagues, the people I had worked alongside for years, echoed from every direction. Each cry cut horrifically short. I tried not to think about what was happening to them in those final moments. Rounding a corner, I collided with Dr. Alvarez, one of the microbiologists. She clung to me, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. Together we raced towards the main lobby, hoping against hope that the emergency gates hadn't sealed. But what we found there was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The polished floor was slick with blood. The air was heavy with the coppery reek. Bodies lay strewn across the tiles like broken dolls, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Some had been torn open, their internal organs painting abstract horrors on the walls. And there, crouched among the gore, was Nemesis. Its scales glistened a wet crimson in the flickering light. Its muscular frame heaved with each breath. As we watched in petrified silence, it lowered its head to one of the corpses and began to feed, its powerful jaws crunching through bone like kindling. Dr. Alvarez let out a choked sob, and the creature's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto us. In that moment, I saw nothing human in its gaze. No flicker of remorse or hesitation, only the flat, unbridled ferocity of an apex predator. It tensed, preparing to pounce, a low growl rumbling in its throat. I grabbed Dr. Alvarez's hand and ran, dragging her towards the eastern stairwell. Behind us, I heard the skittering of claws on linoleum as Nemesis gave chase. Its movements were inhumanly fast. We reached the stairs just as it lunged. Its talons sliced the air inches from my face. We raced upwards, taking the steps two at a time, our lungs burning with each heaving breath. The door to the surface level was just ahead, a tantalizing promise of escape. But even as we neared it, I knew in my heart that it would be locked. The facility security protocols would have seen to that. We were trapped, cornered prey in a concrete maze. Dr. Alvarez reached the door first, her hands scrabbling at the handle. It didn't budge. She let out a wail of despair, pounding her fists against the unyielding metal. I spun around, pressing my back to the door, my eyes wide as I searched for any sign of our pursuer. For a moment, the stairwell was silent. The only sound was our ragged breathing. Then, from the shadows below, I heard it. The click of claws on concrete, the rustle of leathery skin against the walls. It was coming slowly, deliberately savoring the hunt. We had nowhere left to run, no weapons, no hope of fighting back. All we could do was wait, our hearts racing as death stalked ever closer in the darkness. In that moment, I almost welcomed it, yearning for an end to the all-consuming terror. As I braced myself for the feel of rending claws and snapping jaws, I found myself thinking back to the start of Project Cauldron, when Nemesis was nothing more than an abstract concept, a string of code and theory. How arrogant we had been, thinking we could control a force of nature or bend evolution to our whims. In our hubris, we had forgotten the cardinal rule of playing God, that the things we create are never truly ours. They belong to themselves, and sometimes they decide to bite the hand that made them. The clicking of claws grew louder, closer. I closed my eyes, waiting for the pain, for the merciful embrace of oblivion. But it never came. Instead, I heard a sound that, in that moment, was sweeter than any symphony, the thrum of helicopter blades outside, the shouts of men, and the clatter of boots on concrete. Rescue had arrived, but would it be enough to stop the horror we had unleashed? The stairwell door burst open in a shower of splintered wood and twisted metal, nearly crushing Dr. Alvarez and me as we scrambled out of the way through the dust and debris. I saw figures in black tactical gear pouring into the corridor, their assault rifles sweeping the shadows. "Move! Move!" one of them barked, motioning us forward with a gloved hand. We didn't need to be told twice. Staggering to our feet, we raced toward the waiting helicopter, its blades whipping the air into a frenzy. But even as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, stalked by unseen eyes. I glanced back over my shoulder, scanning the tree line that encroached on the facility's perimeter. For a moment, I thought I saw a flash of mottled scales in the undergrowth, a glint of feral hunger, but then it was gone, lost in the dappled shadows. As we climbed into the helicopter, one of the tactical team members grabbed my arm, his face obscured by a dark visor. "Is it contained?" he shouted over the roar of the engines. I shook my head numbly, my voice raw and tight. "No, it's loose. Nemesis is loose." The man cursed under his breath and turned to bark orders at his team. As the helicopter lifted off, I saw them fan out across the facility grounds, their weapons at the ready. The facility looked like a war zone from the air, its pristine white buildings marred by gaping holes and scorch marks. Smoke poured from shattered windows, and the acrid stench of burning chemicals tainted the crisp mountain air. In the courtyard, I saw a makeshift triage area where medics tended to the wounded, their uniforms stained with blood. Dr. Alvarez huddled next to me, her face pale and drawn. "What have we done, Tom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What have we unleashed?" I had no answer for her. In our arrogance, we thought ourselves masters of creation, architects of a new era in warfare, but instead we had birthed a nightmare of pure instinct and savage cunning. And now it was out there, loose, in a world utterly unprepared for its existence. As the helicopter banked away from the facility, I caught a final glimpse of the tactical team moving through the buildings, their flashlight beams cutting swathes through the gloom. A part of me wondered if they truly understood what they were facing, or if they had any inkling of the sheer primal ferocity that dwelt behind those walls. Nemesis was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a chimera of apex predators honed into a singular instrument of death. It wouldn't rest or stop until it had slaked its thirst for blood, and got up anyone who stood in its way. As Montuma's rugged peaks receded into the distance, I felt a chill settle in my bones that had nothing to do with the thinning air. We had opened Pandora's box, and now the nightmare we had created was loose upon the earth. There would be a reckoning for what we had done, a price to pay in blood and terror. I only hoped that when the time came when Nemesis returned to claim its due, we would be ready. Because if we weren't, if we faltered even for a moment, then all the world would learn the true meaning of horror. It would be a lesson written in the anguished screams of the innocent and the dying. In the weeks that followed the breach at Facility 9, a shroud of secrecy descended upon the project, darker and more impenetrable than ever before. The official story was a tragic lab accident, a chemical spill that had claimed the lives of several researchers. The families of the deceased received sealed coffins and government condolences. Their questions met with stony silence. But I knew the truth. We all did, those of us who had been there, who had seen the carnage firsthand. Nemesis was out there, stalking the wilds of Montana like a nightmare made flesh, and sooner or later it would kill again. The tactical team assigned to hunt the creature down scoured the mountains for days, combing every ravine and valley for any sign of its passing. They found tracks, gore-streaked remnants of its meals, deer, bears, once a pack of wolves. But Nemesis itself remained elusive, a ghost in the forest, leaving only blood and terror in its wake. With each passing day, the dread grew. It was only a matter of time, we knew, before the creature turned its sights on easier prey. Humans. I couldn't shake the visions that haunted my dreams. Images of Nemesis rampaging through unsuspecting towns, leaving streets running red and families shattered. In my waking hours, I pored over every scrap of data we had on the creature, desperate for some weakness, some chink in its armored hide. But with each new simulation, each hypothetical scenario, the truth became more and more clear. We'd created the perfect predator, an evolutionary marvel without flaw or vulnerability. In a fair fight, non-humans stood a chance against it. But then, 3 weeks after the breach, a miracle happened. The lone hunter, armed with nothing more than a rifle and sheer stubborn grit, stumbled upon Nemesis in the back country. The man had been tracking elk when he heard the screams, the unmistakable sound of a predator savaging its kill. What he found in that blood-soaked glade defied belief. The hulking form of Nemesis crouched over the ravaged carcass of a grizzly, its claws and teeth still wet with gore. The hunter froze, certain his life was over. But then the creature did something unexpected. It looked up, meeting his gaze with its and in that moment the man swore he saw something flicker in those feral eyes, a spark of what could only be described as recognition, even understanding. For a long, tense heartbeat, man and monster stared at one another, the air heavy with the copper tang of blood. Then, slowly, deliberately, Nemesis turned and melted back into the trees, leaving the stunned hunter to contemplate the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. When the man reported his encounter, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't dared to feel in weeks. Hope. If Nemesis had shown restraint, had chosen not to attack, then perhaps there was still a glimmer of something human buried deep within its engineered genome. A kernel of empathy or reason that could be reached. It was a desperate and dangerous gamble, but one I knew we had to take. I volunteered to lead a new expedition into the mountains, armed not with rifles and tranquilizer darts, but with a single precious vial of the original retrovirus used to create Nemesis. If I could get close enough, inject the creature with a virus, there was a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless, that It would reawaken some hint of humanity buried within the creature's engineered genome. It was a risk worth taking. Armed with a vial and a tranquilizer gun, I set out into the mountains, retracing the steps of the hunter who had encountered Nemesis. For days, I tracked the creature through the wilderness, following the faint traces it left behind: broken branches, clawed tree trunks, the occasional tuft of mottled fur snagged on a briar. Finally, on the 5th day, I found it. Nemesis was crouched beside a mountain stream, drinking from the icy waters. I froze, hardly daring to breathe, as I raised the tranquilizer gun with trembling hands. But before I could take the shot, the creature lifted its head, its nostrils flaring as it caught my scent on the breeze. Those feral eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I saw something I hadn't seen since the day of the breach, a flicker of recognition, of awareness. Slowly, cautiously, I lowered the gun and raised my empty hand, palm outward, in a universal gesture of peace. "I'm here to help you," I said softly, hardly believing the words even as I spoke them. "We can fix this, we can make you whole again." For a more intense moment, Nemesis stared at me, its muscles coiled and ready to spring. Then, to my utter amazement, it took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between us with deliberate, almost tentative movements. My heart pounded as I reached into my pack and withdrew the vial, holding it up for the creature to see. "This will make you better. This won't give you back your humanity." That moment, in a moment I will never forget as long as I live, Nemesis extended its arm, offering its flesh to the needle. With hands shaking from adrenaline and hope, I injected the retrovirus, watching as it vanished beneath that mottled hide. For days afterward, I remained in the mountains, watching over the creature as the virus did its work. Slowly, gradually, I began to see changes, a softening of its features, a gentling of its manner. It was as if the human DNA, suppressed for so long, was reasserting itself, tempering the savagery of the beast. When I finally returned to civilization, I did so with Nemesis at my side, not as a captive or an experiment, but as a living testament to the power of science and the resilience of the human spirit. It would take time, I knew, for the world to accept what had happened, to grapple with the implications of Project Cauldron and the horrors it had wrought. But as I looked into those eyes, no longer feral and fierce, but curious and aware, I knew that we had a chance to learn from our mistakes, to grow and evolve as a species. Nemesis was more than just a creature, more than an experiment gone awry. It was a mirror held up to the human soul, reflecting both our darkest impulses and our noblest aspiration. And in that reflection I saw hope for a future in which man and monster could perhaps find a way to coexist, to learn from one another, and build a world stronger and wiser than the one we had nearly destroyed. It was a hope born in blood and terror, but tempered by compassion and understanding. As Nemesis and I walked out of those mountains and into the uncertain future that awaited us, I felt the weight of that hope upon my shoulders, a burden and a blessing, a reminder of all we had endured and all we had yet to face. But I knew deep in my heart that we would face it together, man and beast, scientist and experiment, bound by a shared destiny that would shape the course of history for generations to come. And so ends the tale of Nemesis, the creature that taught us the true meaning of humanity. May its legacy endure, and may we never forget the lessons it imparted, lessons of hubris and humility, of science and nature, of the eternal struggle between our better angels and our darkest demons. For in the end, it is only by embracing both that we can hope to become what we were always meant to be. Not gods or monsters, but something greater, something more enduring. We must become human. My name is Raymond Callahan, but most people just call me Ray. I've spent most of my life working as a park ranger, though that wasn't the plan originally. I was supposed to be a school teacher, settled down with my wife in a cozy little town. Life has a funny way of steering you off course, and here I am with a rifle in my hand and the endless wilderness as my backyard. The woods have been my home for years now. The place I work is called Eagle Creek State Park, a sprawling stretch of rugged land in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. Not exactly a tourist hotspot, but it's got its charms, if you like. Isolation, thick forests, and the kind of quiet that makes you second-guess your sanity. We get the occasional hiker or camper, but for the most part it's just me and the trees, and that's how I like it. Except for the last couple of weeks. Things have felt off. It started with a few reports of missing people, 2 college kids who never returned to their camp, a seasoned hiker whose car was found abandoned by the entrance. And most recently, a family of 4 search parties were sent out, and the usual suspects were considered bears, coyote, even a rogue mountain lion, but there was no trace of them, no bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to the unpredictability of nature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was this tension in the air, like the park was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper, and the silence heavier. A week ago, I got a call from my boss, Dale O'Connor, who told me they were sending a couple of new rangers to help with the situation. I wasn't thrilled about it. I'm not much of a people person, and I like my space, but these weren't normal circumstances, so I agreed to show them around, make sure they didn't get lost or eaten by something. The new rangers, Greg Walters and Sam Blackwell, were younger than me by at least a decade. Greg was ex-military, tall and built like a tank with a no-nonsense attitude that rubbed me the wrong way. Sam was quieter, more of an academic type, with a tendency to overthink everything. They seemed competent enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't over their heads. It was early morning when we set out to patrol a particularly dense part of the park where the missing family had last been seen. The sky was overcast and the air was thick with humidity, making everything feel sticky and uncomfortable. We walked in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. About an hour into our hike, we came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a pile of bones, scattered and broken, half buried under a thick layer of leaves. Human bones by the look of them. Greg and Sam stopped dead in their tracks, their faces pale. "What the hell happened here?" Greg muttered, kneeling down to get a closer look. "No idea," I replied, though my mind was racing. I'd seen animal attacks before, and this wasn't like any of them. The bones were stripped clean, but there were no tooth marks, no signs of chewing or gnawing, just bones bleached white and dry as if they'd been there for years. No, they clearly hadn't. "We should call this in." Sam suggested pulling out his radio, but as he reached for it, a strange sound filled the air. It was low and resonant, like a deep hum, but there was an underlying rhythm to it, almost like a heartbeat. It seemed to come from all around us, vibrating through the ground, the trees, and even the air itself. "What the hell is that?" Greg asked, his voice tight with unease. I shook my head, unable to answer. The sound was disorienting, making it hard to think straight. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The silence rushed back in, pressing against our eardrums. "Let's keep moving," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll radio this in when we get back to the station." But as we continued our patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something ancient and hungry had awoken in these woods and it knew we were here. The rest of our patrol that morning passed without further incident, but the unease lingered like a bad taste in the mouth. Greg and Sam tried to engage in some small talk, but it fell flat. Their voices sounded thin and strained in the oppressive silence of the forest. We returned to the ranger station around noon, where we reported our findings to Dale. He listened with a furrowed brow, his fingers drumming on his desk. "Human bones, you say?" he asked, looking at me. "And no signs of an animal attack?" I shook my head. Then that I could see. It was unusual. Dale sighed, rubbing his eyes. "This is getting out of hand. I'm going to have to call in some outside help." In the meantime, I want you three to keep patrolling, but be careful. If you find anything else, anything at all, you radio it immediately. Understand?" We nodded and Dale dismissed us. As we left his office, Greg turned to me, his face grim. "What do you think is going on here, Ray?" he asked. "I've seen some weird stuff in my time, but this is something else." I didn't have an answer for him. What I knew was that the woods had changed. There was something out there, something that didn't belong, and it was growing bolder by the day. Over the next few days, we continued our patrols, combing through the dense underbrush and rocky terrain. We found more bones, always human, always stripped clean. And then there were the sounds, that deep pulsing hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was getting more frequent, lasting longer each time. One evening, as we were heading back to the station after a long day, Sam stopped suddenly, his head cocked to one side. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Greg and I strained our ears, but all I could hear was the usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant call of a coyote. "I don't hear anything," Greg said, but Sam shook his head. "It's not a sound. It's a feeling like we're not alone out here." I knew what he meant. I'd felt it too, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of eyes watching from the shadows. But I didn't want to admit it. Didn't want to give voice to the fear that had been growing in my gut. "Let's just get back," I said, shouldering my rifle. "It's getting late." But as we walked, the feeling intensified. The shadows seemed to deepen, the trees pressing in closer, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a movement, something large and dark slipping through the underbrush. I spun around, raising my rifle, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. "What is it?" Greg asked, his own weapon at the ready. I thought I saw... Never mind. It was nothing, but even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. There was something out there watching us, waiting, and sooner or later it was going to make its move. The next morning we set out earlier than usual, the morning mist still clinging to the ground. There had been another disappearance overnight, a lone hiker who had ventured off trail and never returned. Dale was in a foul mood, snapping at anyone who got too close. He'd been on the phone all night trying to get some help from the state police, but they were stretched thin as it was. "It's up to us," he said, his jaw clenched. "We need to find out what's happening out there, and we need to stop it." I couldn't argue at that. Whatever was in these woods, it was our responsibility. We were the ones who knew this place, who had sworn to protect it, and the people who ventured into it. We decided to split up to cover more ground. Greg would take the northern section, Sam the southern, and I would head east towards the river. We agreed to check in every hour by radio and to return to the station by nightfall. As I set out, the woods seemed to close in around me. The silence was broken only by the crunch of my boots on the trail. I'd walked this path 100 times before, but today it felt different. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. About 2 hours into my patrol, I came across a small clearing. It was a place I knew well. A popular spot for campers with a clear view of the stars at night. As I stepped into the clearing, I froze. There, in the center of the clearing, was a symbol carved into the ground. It was large, at least 10 feet across, and it consisted of a series of interlocking circles and lines forming a pattern that was both intricate and unsettling. I'd never seen anything like it before. As I approached, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was something about this symbol, something that felt ancient and powerful. I knelt down, tracing my fingers over the lines. They were deep, cut into the earth with a precision that seemed almost inhuman. And then I heard it again, that deep, pulsing hum, louder than ever before. It seemed to be coming from the symbol itself, vibrating up through the ground and into my bones. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for my radio, but before I could speak, a voice crackled through the static. "Ray, are you there?" It was Sam, his voice tight with fear. I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's wrong?" "I found something. You need to see this." "What is it?" "Just get here and hurry." The line went dead, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. I raced through the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached Sam's location, I found him standing at the edge of a small ravine, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Look," he said, pointing down into the ravine. I stepped forward, peering over the edge, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, at the bottom of the ravine, was a pile of bodies, human bodies, their limbs twisted and broken, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, and standing over them, its form, still and silent, was a creature out of a nightmare. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. The skin was a mottled gray, rough and textured like the bark of a tree, but it was its face that made my heart stop. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, blank surface that seemed to absorb the light around it. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stood there staring at this impossible thing, our minds trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Then, slowly, the creature turned its head towards us. Time seemed to slow down as the creature regarded us, its featureless face impossible to read. I could feel Sam trembling beside me, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My own heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "What do we do?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of blood in my ears. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This thing, this creature, it couldn't be real. It defied every law of nature, every ounce of rational thought. And yet there it was, standing in front of us, as real as the trees were in the sky. Slowly, I raised my rifle, my hand shaking. I had no idea if it would do any good, but it was the only thing I could think to do. The creature didn't move, didn't react in any way. It just stood there watching us with that blank, expressionless face. And then it took a step forward. Sam let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward. I stood my ground, my finger tightening on the trigger, but before I could fire, the creature moved. It was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment it was standing at the bottom of the ravine. The next it was right in front of me, its face inches from mine. I could feel its breath on my skin, cold and damp and smelling of decay. Up close, I could see that its skin wasn't just rough, it was moving, pulsing with a sickening rhythm. And then I heard a voice in my head, a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien. "You're not welcome here," it said, echoing through my mind. "Leave now or join the others." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed, held in place by some unseen force. Dimly I was aware of Sam screaming, of the sound of his footsteps crashing through the underbrush as he fled. But I couldn't turn my head, I couldn't look away from those empty, soulless eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. I blinked, gasping for air, my knees buckling beneath me. I fell to the ground, my rifle clattering beside me. For a long moment, I just lay there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was the sound of my radio crackling to life that finally snapped me out of it. It was Greg, his voice tight with concern. "Ray." "Sam, what's going on out there?" I heard screaming. I grabbed the radio, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the button. "Greg," I said, my voice hoarse, "we found something. You need to get back to the station now. We need help." "What? What did you find?" Just get back there and be careful. There's something out here, something's not right." I hauled myself to my feet, my legs feeling like jelly. I had to find Sam, I had to make sure he was okay. Then he had to get the hell out of these woods before whatever that thing was came back. As I stumbled through the trees, following the path of broken branches and trampled undergrowth that marked Sam's flight, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around me. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive, and everywhere I looked, I could swear I saw movement, could hear the whisper of something ancient and hungry stalking us through the trees. When I finally found Sam, he was huddled against the base of a large oak, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes wide and staring. He was mumbling something under his breath, the same words over and over again. "It's not possible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not possible." I knelt down beside him, putting a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at my touch, his eyes snapping to mine. "We have to go," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We have to get out of here now," he nodded, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. I helped him to his feet, half supporting, half dragging him as we made our way back to the trail. Every step was an effort, my body feeling like it was moving through molasses. But we had to keep going, had to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. It's only when we stumbled out of the trees and into the clearing around the ranger station that I allowed myself to breathe. Greg was waiting for us, his face etched with worry. "What happened?" he asked, taking in our haggard appearance. "What did you find out there?" I shook my head, unable to find the words. How could I even begin to describe what we had seen, what we had experienced? "We need to call for backup," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "We need to get everyone out of these woods now, before it's too late." The call went out, and within hours the park was swarming with activity, state troopers, wildlife officials, even a few federal agents who had been in the area. They set up a command center in the ranger station. The air was thick with the crackle of radios and the hum of generators. I gave my report, trying to keep my voice steady as I described what we had seen. The bodies in the ravine, the creature with its pulsing skin and empty eyes. I could see the skepticism on their faces, the disbelief. I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it either. They sent out search parties, armed men and women, combing through the woods, looking for any sign of the missing hikers. But as the days stretched on, it became clear that they wouldn't find anything. Whatever had taken those people, it wasn't going to give them up easily. The creature, if that's what it was, had vanished back into the depths of the forest, leaving no trace of its presence. As the search efforts wound down, the authorities began questioning our story. They suggested perhaps we were mistaken, that stress from the situation got to us. They even hinted we might have had something to do with the disappearances ourselves. I couldn't blame them for their doubts. In the harsh light of day, away from the oppressive shadows of the trees, it all seemed so unreal. A part of me wanted to believe it was all a nightmare, a figment of my overworked imagination. Deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen that thing, I had felt its presence in my mind, and I knew it was still out there, waiting, watching. In the end, the official report listed the disappearances as unsolved, the result of some unknown environmental hazard. The park was closed indefinitely, pending further investigation. Sam and Greg both left shortly after, unable to cope with the memories of what we had seen. I don't blame them. A part of me wanted to leave too, but I couldn't do it. This was my home, this was my responsibility. Whatever was out there, whatever ancient primal force we had awakened, it was up to me to find a way to put it back to rest. In the months that followed, I pored over old books and maps, trying to learn everything I could about the history of these woods. I spoke to local tribal elders, listening to their stories of ancient spirits and forgotten gods, and slowly, piece by piece, I began to uncover the truth. The creature we had seen was old, older than the forest itself. It was a being of immense power, a guardian of the wild places, and we, in our arrogance, had trespassed into its domain, had disturbed its slumber. I knew that I had to find a way to appease this ancient entity to show it that we meant no harm. And so, on a cold, moonless night, I ventured back into the woods alone. I brought with me an offering, a token of respect and reverence. I placed it at the base of the oldest, mightiest tree I could find, and then I waited. At first there was nothing, just the silent whisper of the wind through the leaves. Then I felt it, that same presence that I had felt in the ravine, the weight of an ancient, inhuman gaze upon me. I spoke then, my voice trembling as I poured out my heart. I told the entity of my respect for the forest, for the power and mystery that dwelled within it. I pledged myself to its service, to the protection of this wild and untamed place. And then for just a moment I felt a touch upon my mind, the briefest flicker of acknowledgement. And I knew that my offering had been accepted, that a truce had been struck between the old world and the new. In the years since, the disappearances have stopped. The forest has returned to its quiet, watchful ways. But I know that the entity is still out there, silent and unseen, guarding its ancient secrets. And as for me, I remain here, a solitary figure among the trees. I walk the trails and keep watch, a guardian in my own right. I know now that there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding, forces that we can only glimpse in the shadowed corners of our minds. But perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some doors meant to stay closed, and perhaps in the end it is enough simply to stand in the presence of something greater than ourselves, to feel the touch of the wild upon our souls, and to know that we are a part of something ancient and eternal. So if you should find yourself in these woods, tread lightly and with respect, for you walk in the domain of something old and powerful, something that watches and waits in the silence of the trees. And if you listen closely, you may just hear the whisper of its ancient voice upon the wind. It was 1996 in Shenandoah National Park, Virginia, and I was dealing with the usual ranger work. Tracking lost hikers, dealing with tourists who thought leave no trace was just a suggestion. The name's Owen Reed, and I've been doing this job for about 11 years now. Never expected the kind of horror that unfolded that day. You'd think over a decade out in the wild would harden you to most things, right? Make you impervious to fear, unflappable in the face of the unknown. But there are some experiences that cut right through whatever armor you think you've built up, leaving you as vulnerable as a lost child in the dark. No amount of time can truly prepare you for seeing the kind of stuff that makes you second guess whether you're awake or stuck in some twisted nightmare. The sort of thing that defies explanation, that challenges everything you thought you knew about the natural world. I sure wasn't prepared to deal with whatever the hell it was that showed up that day. But then again, who would be? My day had started innocently enough with a simple call. 2 hikers, a young man and woman, both in their 20s, had gone missing. They ventured off trail somewhere near Hazel Mountain Overlook, where the woods grow thick and dense, the canopy blotting out the sun. I was the unlucky soul sent to track them down. Call it intuition. Call it years of experience. But my gut was already telling me it was going to be one of those days. The kind where something somewhere would go very wrong. The sky above was an ominous slate gray, heavy with the promise of rain. At least it was holding off for now. The air smelled damp and earthy, like the soil itself was exhaling, holding on to the moisture of the night. Before I slung my pack over my shoulder, the comforting weight of my supplies pressing against my back, double-checked my radio, made sure it was secure. Then, with a deep breath, I headed into the shadowy embrace of the forest. At first, I figured I'd probably find these kids perched on a log somewhere, a little scuffed up and embarrassed, probably trying to convince each other they weren't actually lost and just temporarily misplaced. It wouldn't be the first time I'd come across a pair of inexperienced hikers who'd bitten off more than they could chew. But as I pushed deeper into the woods, following the vague direction of their last known location, a sense of unease began to prickle at the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched, of something unseen tracking my movements. I chalked it up to nerves, to the gloomy atmosphere of the overcast day. Told myself I was just jumpy, letting my imagination get the better of me. Oh, how I wish that had been the case. That my growing dread was nothing more than a trick of my own mind. But what I found out there among the twisted trees wasn't some clueless, sheepish hikers. No, what I stumbled across was something far more sinister. As I hiked deeper into the thickening forest, the sounds of civilization fell away, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. My footsteps seemed to echo too loudly, each crunch of leaves and snap of twigs under my boots, a jarring intrusion. The birds had gone quiet, the usual chatter of squirrels and chipmunks conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath, leaving the woods in a state of unnatural stillness. That kind of silence isn't normal, not out here. It's the kind that makes your skin crawl, the hair on your arms stand at attention, the kind that tells you something is very, very wrong. About 2 hours into my search, I finally picked up a trail, broken branches, scuffed earth, all the typical signs of a panicked flight. The kind of trail that screams, "We went from a pleasant walk to get me the hell out of here." My unease grew as I followed the path of disturbed foliage deeper into the forest, scanning the trees for any sign of the missing hikers. When I found their packs discarded haphazardly by the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak, dread settled like a stone in my gut. It's never a good sign when gear gets left behind. It means they were in too much of a hurry to bother with it, shedding weight in favor of speed. What could have sent them fleeing with such thoughtless abandon? What horrors had they seen or thought they'd seen out here in the lonely wilderness? These questions nagged at me as I examined their abandoned belongings, searching for clues, for any hint of what fate had befallen them. That's when I saw it smeared across the rough bark of a nearby tree, glistening slightly in the gloomy light blood. Not a lot, but enough to tell a grim story, enough to confirm my worst suspicions that at least one of them was hurt, possibly badly. A chill raced down my spine at the sight, my hand unconsciously tightening around the strap of my pack. I took a deep breath, tried to steady my nerves, reminding myself I'd faced worse things out here, dealt with God knows how many injured and missing people over the years. But there was something different about this. Something that set my teeth on edge and made my heart beat just a little bit faster, a sense of malevolence in the air. Some primitive evil lurking just out of sight. I tried to shake it off to focus on the task at hand, radioed back to the station, voice low and tense to report my findings. The metallic crackle of static was my only reply. Proceed with caution, hissing across the line. As if I needed the reminder, as if every instinct I had wasn't already screaming at me to turn back, to get out of these woods while I still could. But I had a job to do, people to find. I couldn't just abandon them to whatever fate had dragged them off the trail. So I pressed on, following the intermittent trail of blood spatters and broken vegetation. Each step felt heavier than the last, my boots strangely loud against the forest floor. I felt eyes on me boring into my back, tracking my every move. But every time I spun around, pulse spiking, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows and my own mounting paranoia. It wasn't until I'd gone another 50 yards that I found the first body, or rather what was left of it. The sight stopped me cold, a wave of nausea rising in my throat. I've seen animal attacks before, the messy aftermath of a bear or mountain lion defending its territory. But this was different. The corpse was mangled almost beyond recognition, flesh and bone and earth mingling in a gruesome tableau. It was hard to tell where the body ended and the forest floor began, so violently had it been ripped apart. And yet there was a strange precision to the carnage, a methodical savagery that seemed almost deliberate. This was no frenzied mauling, no desperate struggle for survival. No, whatever had done this had taken its time, had reveled in the act of tearing a human being to shreds. The thought made my skin crawl, a cold sweat breaking out across my brow despite the chill in the air. I don't know how I held it together in that moment, staring down at the shredded remains of what had once been a living, breathing person. Maybe it was the dark, morbid humor that comes with a job, the kind that has you cracking jokes in the face of unspeakable tragedy, because if you don't laugh, you'll start screaming, and once you start, you might never stop. Well, I muttered to myself, the words sounding too loud in the oppressive stillness of the forest. Looks like somebody had a bad day. It was wildly inappropriate. Given the grim scene before me, the understatement of the century, Ogallo's humor was all I had. The only defense against the horror slowly unfurling itself in my mind. I didn't have long to dwell on the macabre joke because that's when I heard it. A sound that turned my blood to ice in my veins. Made every hair on my body stand at attention, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, footsteps slow and deliberate coming my way. I froze, hardly daring to breathe, listened intently, trying to gauge the direction, the distance. Too heavy to be a deer, too light for a bear, which left only one chilling possibility that whatever had reduced the hiker to a pile of shredded meat was still out there and it was coming for me. My heart pounded. I crouched down behind the thick trunk of a nearby tree, pressing my back against the rough bark. I tried to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible, like a rabbit hiding from a hawk. I strained my ears for any hint of movement, any sign that I'd been spotted. The footsteps drew closer, each soft crunch of leaves an ominous countdown. I held my breath, my muscles tense to the point of pain. Silently, I prayed to whatever gods might be listening that I'd somehow escape notice that the thing out there would pass me by. But then, just as the steps sounded like they were right on top of me, they stopped. Silence descended once again, thick and heavy. A bead of sweat trickled down my temple, my mouth was dry as bone. I counted my heartbeats, tried to slow my breathing, waited for the footsteps to resume or fade into the distance. Instead, I heard something that chilled me to my very core. A sound I'll never forget. Not as long as I live. A low guttural growl, somewhere between an animal's snarl and a human moan. It seemed to echo through the trees, vibrating in my chest like the thrum of a bass drum. Not quite a roar, not exactly a scream, but filled with an inhuman malice that made my stomach twist and my skin prickle with goosebumps. It was a sound of hunger, of rage, of pure, unfettered savagery. And it was close, too damn close. I huddled behind my meager shelter, eyes screwed shut, trying not to whimper, trying not to imagine the thing that could make a noise like that, the claws and teeth and pure malevolent strength. The seconds stretched into eternity as I waited, hardly breathing for the creature to make its move. But the attack never came. After what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, the footsteps resumed, slowly fading into the distance. The oppressive sense of being watched, of being hunted, receded like a dark tide. But the fear remained coiled in my guts like a cold, heavy snake. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my radio, desperate to call for backup. But the only answer was the hiss and crackle of static, the signal blocked by the thick canopy of trees. I was on my own out here with only my wits and a prayer standing between me and whatever nightmare stalked these woods. I allowed myself a moment to gather my composure, to try and still the tremors running through my limbs. Took a deep, steadying breath of the loamy forest air, uncaring of the coppery tang that clung to the back of my throat. Then, with a silent plea to whoever might be watching over wayward rangers, I stepped out from behind the tree and continued my search. The goal? I had to find the girl. If she was still alive, if there was even a chance, I couldn't leave her out here, not with that thing on the prowl. Each step felt like a gamble, every rustle of foliage a potential threat. But I pushed on, following the intermittent trail of destruction deeper into the forest's shadowy embrace. It was almost a relief when I finally found her huddled in the hollow of a fallen tree. She was filthy clothed, torn and stained with mud and worse. Wide haunted eyes darted around like a cornered animal, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a gale. I approached slowly, hands held out in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture, but she shrank back, a whimper escaping her cracked lips. It took several long minutes of coaxing, of gentle words and promises of safety before she'd let me get close. And even then she wouldn't speak, just kept muttering the same phrase over and over, a desperate litany. It saw us. It saw us. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. Raw with terror. I didn't want to ask what it was. The memory of that awful inhuman cry was still fresh in my mind, the echo of those heavy footsteps still ringing in my ears. I knew with a bone-deep certainty that whatever had butchered her companion was still out there, and it wouldn't be satisfied until it had finished the job. We had to move, and fast. I half-coaxed, half-dragged the girl from her hiding spot, slinging her arm over my shoulders to support her weight. She stumbled alongside me, her feet catching on roots and rocks, but I didn't dare slow down, not when every fiber of my being was screaming that we were being watched, that malevolent eyes were tracking our every move. I kept my own gaze forward, scanning the trees for any hint of movement, any shadow that didn't belong. It was almost a surprise when we broke through the tree line, and the sight of my truck parked at the overlook was a blessed relief. I all but threw the girl into the passenger seat, scrambling around to the driver's side, fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I gunned it down the dirt road, gravel spraying from beneath the tires. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the forest, the trees seeming to lean in, reaching out with grasping branches. Then for a moment, just a split second, I swear I saw something else. A figure, tall and dark, standing at the edge of the woods watching us flee, with eyes that glinted red in the fading light. But then we rounded a bend and it was gone. Just a trick of the shadows, the product of my own adrenaline-fueled imagination. At least that's what I told myself as I white-knuckled the steering wheel, the girl's soft sobs filling the cab. It wasn't until we reached the station, the comforting bustle of humanity surrounding us once more, that I allowed myself to breathe, to try and process the nightmare we'd just escaped. The girl was whisked away by medics, wrapped in shock blankets, and gently questioned. I gave my report the words, feeling distant and unreal, even as they left my mouth. But I left out the details of what I'd seen, what I'd heard, the tracks, the blood, the inhuman cries. Because who would believe me? What rational explanation could there be for the savagery we'd witnessed, the primal terror that still coursed through my veins? No better to stick to the facts, to paint a picture of a tragic but ultimately mundane incident. In the days that followed, I learned that more bodies had been found, hikers, campers, all torn to shreds with a ferocity that defied explanation. The official story was a rogue bear, a particularly vicious predator that needed to be put down. I knew better, and so did the locals, if the whispers that began to circulate were any indication. Talk of ancient legends of creatures that stalked the forests long before man ever set foot in these hills. Things that were supposed to be myth campfire stories to scare kids into staying on the trail, but I seen the truth, felt it in my bones. There was something out there, something old and dark and hungry. It was still waiting, still watching, ready to claim its next victim. As for me, I handed in my resignation the next week, hung up my hat and my badge, packed my bags and headed for the city, trying to lose myself in the concrete jungle to forget the nightmare I'd left behind. But I never could shake the feeling of eyes on the back of my neck or a malevolent presence lurking just out of sight. And sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, I swear I can still hear it. That low guttural growl echoing through the trees, calling me back to the forest, back to the horror that waits within. But I'll never go back. Not even if they offered me all the money and accolades in the world. Because some things are meant to stay buried, some secrets best left undisturbed. And whatever stalks the slopes of Hazel Mountain, it's one of them. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur, my mind still reeling from the horrors we'd witnessed in the forest. The girl huddled in the passenger seat, her sobs eventually gave way to a kind of shocked silence. She stared out the window, eyes glazed and unseeing, lost in whatever nightmares played behind them. I couldn't blame her. The memory of that ravaged body, of those inhuman footsteps and unearthly cries, was seared into my own mind. A grotesque slideshow that played on repeat, each grisly image more vivid than the last. I tried to pick up the shattered pieces of my composure as I drove, focusing on the simple task of getting us back to safety, but my mind kept wandering back to those woods, to the impossible thing I'd seen and heard. The growls reverberated in my skull, an echo that refused to fade. The rational part of my brain struggled to process it, to fit the experience into some framework of understanding, but there was no making sense of it. No natural explanation that could account for the sheer wrongness of what we encountered. It defied reason, challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. Glancing over at the girl, I saw my own haunted expression mirrored in her vacant stare. She looked like a shell, a husk, drained of all vitality. And who could blame her? No one should have to see the things we'd seen to feel that primal terror down to their very marrow. I wanted to say something, to offer some word of comfort or reassurance. But what could I possibly say? That it would be alright, that she was safe now. The words rang hollow, even in my own mind. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure if either of us would ever truly feel safe again. Not with the knowledge of what lurked in those hills. The nightmares made flesh. As the ranger station finally came into view, I felt a flicker of relief tempered by a grim realization. This was just the beginning. Once I made my report, once the word got out about what had happened, there would be questions, investigations. And I have to relive it all again, dredge up every grisly detail for the sake of procedure. But that was a problem for later. In that moment, my only concern was getting the girl the help she needed and maybe finding a stiff drink to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. I pulled up to the station, the familiar sight of the weathered wooden building almost jarring in its normalcy. It felt surreal, stepping back into the mundane world after the nightmare we had just escaped. Like waking from a vivid dream, only to find that reality itself had shifted in some indefinable way. The colors seemed too bright, the edges too sharp. Everything felt slightly askew, half-step out of sync with the way things should be. I helped the girl from the truck, supporting her weight as we made our way inside. The station was quiet, just a skeleton crew on duty. With them all, they laid eyes on us, on the shocked, haunted looks on our faces and the blood and grime caking our clothes. A flurry of activity erupted. Questions flew, voices overlapping in a cacophony of concern and urgency. I waved them off, insisting that the girl be seen to first. Someone wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, guiding her gently to a chair. Another pressed a mug of something hot and steaming into her hands, the scent of chamomile wafting through the air. I watched, feeling strangely detached as they tended to her. It was like I was observing the scene from outside myself, a passive spectator to the drama unfolding. A shock I realized dimly. It was starting to set in, the adrenaline that had kept me going finally receding and leaving exhaustion and numb disbelief in its wake. Someone was talking to me, asking me questions. I blinked, trying to focus, to pull myself back into the moment. It was the chief ranger, his weathered face creased with concern. He wanted to know what had happened, where the other hiker was. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly explain the inexplicable put into language, the sheer mind-rending wrongness of what we'd seen? I shook my head, a shudder running through me. He's dead. I managed, my voice sounding distant and hoarse to my own ears. Something got him, tore him apart. I've never seen anything like it. The chief's eyes widened, his face paling slightly. He glanced at the girl, huddled and shivering under her blanket, then back at me. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the dawning realization that this was no ordinary animal attack. "Okay," he said slowly, his voice carefully measured. "Start from the beginning, tell me everything." So I did. The words poured out of me, a jumbled, disjointed narrative of horror and confusion. I told him about finding the abandoned packs, the blood trail, about the savage body and the footsteps that shouldn't exist, and then, haltingly, about the noises, the growls that were more than animal, the sense of malevolent intelligence lurking in the shadows. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief, the skepticism warring with a growing unease in his expression, because, as much as he might want to dismiss my account as the ravings of a shocked, traumatized mind, deep down he knew I had spent enough time in these woods, heard enough whispers and old stories to know that there were things out there that defied explanation, things that most people dismiss as superstition or folklore, but that those who lived and worked in the park knew better than to discount entirely. And looking at me, at the haunted, shell-shocked figure I presented, he couldn't deny that something truly terrifying had happened out there. When I finished, a heavy silence descended. The chief rubbed a hand over his face, looking suddenly old and tired beyond his years. I could almost see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he grappled with the implications of my story. "Christ," he muttered, shaking his head. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm calling in a search and rescue team to sweep the area, see if they can find any sign of whatever did this. In the meantime, you and the girl are going to get checked out by medical. I want to make sure neither of you are hurt." I nodded numbly, too drained to argue. A part of me wanted to protest, to insist on going back out there, on finding and confronting the thing that had shattered our world. But a larger part, the part that was still paralyzed with fear and reeling with shock, recognized the futility of that impulse. Whatever was stalking those woods, whatever ancient malevolent force had awakened, I was no match for it. None of us were. The next few hours passed in a haze of questions and examinations of gentle hands and concerned faces. The medics clocked and fussed over us, checking for injuries, for signs of shock or trauma. Physically we were unharmed, but the scars on our psyches, the invisible wounds left by our brush with the unthinkable, those would take much longer to heal if they ever did. I gave my statement again, this time to the police that had been called in from the nearest town. They listened with a mix of skepticism and unease, the same battle playing out on their faces that I'd seen on the chief's. They wanted a rational explanation, a neat and tidy narrative to fit into their paperwork and reports, but there was none to be had. How do you file a report on the impossible? How do you put into cold, clinical terms an experience that shakes the very foundations of your understanding of the world? In the end, they took my statement, promising to investigate further. But I could see in their eyes that they were already trying to distance themselves from the implications, to find some way to rationalize and compartmentalize the horrors we described. As for the girl, she was taken to the hospital for further evaluation and treatment. The last I saw of her, she was being loaded into an ambulance, her face pale and haunted beneath the oxygen mask. I wondered if she would ever recover, if the nightmares that lurked behind her eyes would ever truly fade. And what of me? What did the future hold for a man who had seen the face of true terror, who had brushed against the dark underbelly of a world he thought he knew? In the immediate aftermath, all I could feel was a deep weariness, a numbness that went beyond mere exhaustion. But as the shock began to wear off, as the fog of disbelief and denial started to lift, I knew that I couldn't stay. I couldn't continue to walk those trails, to spend my days in the shadow of the mountains that now loomed ominously in my mind. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig would send me into a spiral of panic and dread, the echoes of those unearthly growls ringing in my ears. No, I needed to get away, to put as much distance as I could between myself and the nightmare I'd witnessed. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind still reeling, I handed in my resignation, packed my bags, said goodbye to the few colleagues who hadn't been chased off by the haunted look in my eyes, and left. I thought that would be the end of it, that by leaving the park, immersing myself in the bustle and noise of the city, I could somehow leave the horror behind as well. But I was wrong. Oh, how I was wrong. Because you can outrun the truth, no matter how hard you try. And the truth was that there was something out there in those woods. Something ancient, dark, and hungry. Something that had tasted human flesh and would inevitably crave more. In the weeks and months that followed, I watched the news with a pit of dread in my stomach. More disappearances, more animal attacks. The official story was a rogue bear, a particularly aggressive predator that needed to be put down. But I knew better, and so did the locals. If the whispers that began to circulate were any indication, rumors of creatures that walked the forest on two legs, of dark shapes glimpsed between the trees, and glowing eyes in the night. The old legends resurfaced, stories that had been passed down for generations, warning of the things that stalked the shadows of the park. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my problem anymore, that I'd left that world behind, but the guilt gnawed at me, the knowledge that I'd escaped while others continued to fall victim to the nightmare that lurked in those hills. It felt like a coward's choice, like I was abandoning my duty, my responsibility. But what could I do? I was just one man, haunted and broken by an experience that defied all reason. I had no weapons against the thing in the forest, no means to fight the impossible. All I had were my scars, both physical and mental, and the unshakable certainty that I would never again set foot in Shenandoah National Park. And so I tried to move on, to build a new life far from the shadow of those mountains. But the memories lingered, the nightmares, a constant companion and always in the back of my mind. The knowledge that it was still out there, waiting, watching, hungry. A part of me knows that I'll never truly escape the horror of what I witnessed that day. It's woven into the fabric of my being now, a dark thread that can never be unraveled, and sometimes in the deepest reaches of the night, I swear I can still hear it, that guttural, inhuman growl echoing through the caverns of my mind, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of our understanding, the primal fear that we can never truly outrun. In those moments I almost feel its pull, the terrible, inexorable draw back to the mountains, back to the heart of the nightmare. But I resist clinging to the fragile threads of my sanity, to the hope that distance and time will somehow dull the razor's edge of my terror. But deep down I know the truth. I know that it's only a matter of time before the thing in the forest claims another victim, and a part of me wonders if in some twisted way I share in the blame. If by running, by staying silent, I've doomed others to the fate that merely claimed me. It's a burden I'll carry for the rest of my days, a weight that can never be lifted. And so I go on, one foot in front of the other, trying to outpace the shadows that nip at my heels, that in the lonely watches of the night, when the world is still and silent, and the ghosts of memory come calling. I know that it's still out there, and I pray with every fiber of my being that I never have to face it again. For I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that next time I may not be so lucky. In the days that followed my escape from the park, I tried to lose myself in the numbing routine of normal life. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. It was a cycle I clung to with desperate fervor, hoping that the sheer mundanity of it would somehow overwrite the memories that haunted me. But it was a futile effort. The horror of what I'd experienced, and the mind-bending wrongness of it, had sunk its claws deep into my psyche. It lurked at the edges of my consciousness, a constant malevolent presence that no amount of distraction could banish. I jumped at shadows, I flinched at sudden noises. The simple act of walking down a darkened street at night became an exercise in terror. Every alleyway and doorway a potential hiding place for unspeakable horrors. I knew intellectually that I was being irrational, that the likelihood of encountering anything like what I'd seen in the park here in the city was vanishingly small. But trauma has a way of overriding reason, of short-circuiting the logical pathways of the brain, and my trauma ran deep, etched into every synapse and nerve ending. It was a constant companion, a second shadow that dogged my every step. Sleep became an elusive beast, my nights haunted by vivid, blood-soaked nightmares. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echoes of inhuman growls ringing in my ears. The face of the girl, pale and haunted and streaked with tears, was a recurring specter, her accusing eyes boring into my soul. I knew I needed help. The weight of what I'd experienced was too much for any one person to bear alone. But who could I turn to? What therapist? What counselor would believe my tale of impossible creatures and eldritch horrors lurking in the depths of the forest? I'd be lucky if they didn't have me committed, locked away in some sterile, white-walled room with nothing but my nightmares for company. And so I suffered in silence, bearing my scars and my guilt like a private cross. A burden that grew heavier with each passing day. It was almost a relief when the news started trickling in, scattered reports of more disappearances, more grisly animal attacks in the park. Not because I took any joy in the suffering of others, but because it meant that I wasn't alone, that the horror I'd witnessed wasn't just some figment of a broken mind, but a tangible, undeniable reality. I followed the stories with morbid fascination, scouring the internet for every scrap of information I could find. Official statements were vague and guarded, carefully crafted to avoid inciting panic. But reading between the lines, I could see the cracks in the facade, hints of something much darker and more sinister lurking beneath the surface. And then, buried deep in the depths of obscure forums and conspiracy theory websites, I found them whispers and rumors, fragments of stories passed down through generations of locals, tales of creatures that walk the woods on two legs, dark shapes glimpsed between the trees, and glowing eyes at night. Most dismissed them as mere folklore, superstitions of a simpler, more credulous age. But I knew better. I'd seen the truth of those legends written in blood and terror etched into my very soul. And as I delved deeper, a picture began to emerge. A tapestry of horror woven across centuries. The stories varied in their details, but certain threads remained constant. A presence in the mountains, ancient and malevolent. A hunger that could never be sated. A darkness that yearned to consume. And always the sense of something watching from the shadows, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was a bitter validation, a grum confirmation of the nightmare I'd been trying so hard to escape. But it was also, in a strange, twisted way, a comfort, because it meant that I wasn't crazy, that the horrors that haunted my every waking moment weren't just the product of a shattered psyche. And with that realization came a flicker of something else, a faint spark amidst the ashes of my once unshakable worldview. Purpose, because if this nightmare-made flesh was real, then someone had to do something about it. Someone had to stand against the darkness to protect the innocent and unsuspecting from the horrors that lurked in the depths of the forest. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't my fight, that I'd already given more than anyone could be expected to, that I'd earned my peace, my chance at a normal life away from the shadows of the park. But deep down I knew it was a lie, because I was one of the few who knew the truth, who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. And with that knowledge came a responsibility, a duty that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I might want to. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind still haunted by nightmares, I began to plan, to research, to gather what scraps of information I could about the thing in the woods. It was a daunting task, a challenge that threatened to overwhelm me at every turn, but I pressed on, driven by a grim determination, a need to make sense of the impossible. I scoured old newspapers and historical records, searching for any mention of strange occurrences or unexplained disappearances in the park. I delved into the folklore of the local tribes, the stories and legends passed down through generations. and slowly, painstakingly, a picture began to emerge. The creature, it seemed, had been a part of the mountains for as long as anyone could remember. The Native Americans who had once inhabited the area had a name for it, a word that translated roughly to the Hungry One. They spoke of it in hushed tones with a mix of fear and reverence, as if it were some dark god to be appeased rather than a monster to be slain. There were stories of sacrifices, of young warriors sent into the woods never to return. Their fate was a grim tithe to keep the creature at bay. And there were tales of those who had crossed its path and lived broken shadows of their former selves, haunted by the memory of its terrible visage. But as settlers came and tribes dwindled, the old ways were forgotten, the ancient pacts left to wither in the dust. And the thing in the woods, no longer sated by its customary offerings, began to stir to hunt. Over the years, there had been disappearances, hikers and campers vanishing without a trace, their fates chalked up to accidents or animal attacks. But there was a pattern to it, a grim cycle that repeated every few decades, as if the creature was slumbering, waiting until its hunger grew too great to ignore. And now it seemed that time had come again. The disappearances were growing more frequent, the animal attacks more brazen and gruesome. It was as if the thing in the woods was growing bolder, more confident in its power, its ability to evade detection. The knowledge weighed heavy on my mind, a burden that grew more crushing with each passing day. I knew I had to do something to find a way to stop the creature before more innocent lives were lost. But I also knew that I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies, people who would believe my story, who had the resources and the expertise to help me take on this impossible fight. And so, with a trembling hand and a heart full of trepidation, I began to reach out. I contacted the few friends I had left from my days as a ranger, people who had spent their lives in the park, who knew its secrets and its dangers. Most of them thought I was crazy, or traumatized, or both. They urged me to seek help to let go of my delusions and move on with my life. But a precious few, listened. They had seen things too strange and inexplicable, events that had shaken their faith in the rational world. And while they might not have been ready to accept the full truth of what I was saying, they were willing to hear me out, to consider the possibility that there was more to the story than the official line. With their help, I began to gather resources to plan and prepare for what I knew would be the fight of my life. We pored over maps of the park, marking the locations of the disappearances, looking for patterns, for some clues to the creature's hunting grounds. We researched old methods of tracking and trapping, of dealing with predators, both natural and supernatural, silver fire, ancient wards, and sigils. We left no stone unturned, no avenue unexplored. And all the while the nightmares continued, visions of blood and shadow, glowing eyes and grasping claws. I woke each morning with a sense of dread, knowing that every day we delayed was another chance for the creature to claim a new victim. I also woke with a sense of purpose, a grim determination that had been forged in the crucible of my terror. I had seen the face of true evil, had felt its hot breath on my neck, and I knew with a certainty that went beyond mere faith that I was the only one who could stop it. And so, with my small but dedicated band of allies at my side, I began to make my preparation. We gathered our gear, our weapons, and our wards, and we set out for the park, for the heart of the nightmare that had haunted me for so long. It was a journey into the unknown, a descent into a darkness that threatened to swallow us whole. But I knew there could be no turning back, no retreat in the face of the horror that awaited us. For I had seen the abyss, had gazed into the face of the thing that lurked within, and I knew that if we failed, if we faltered in our resolve, it would not be just our lives that were lost, but countless others. The creature would grow stronger, bolder, its appetite whetted by our failure, and the cycle of horror and death would continue unchecked and unstoppable. If we succeeded, if by some miracle we could banish this ancient evil back to the depths from whence it came, then perhaps, just perhaps, I could find some measure of peace, some way to quiet the screaming in my mind. to wash the blood from my hands. It was a slim hope, a flickering candle against the raging storm of my trauma, but it was all I had left, the only thing that kept me putting one foot in front of the other, driving me ever onwards into the heart of the nightmare. And so, with a deep breath and a silent prayer to any god that might be listening, I stepped once more into the shadows of the forest, my allies at my back and my demons at my heels, and the hunt began. The journey back to the park was a surreal experience, a twisting kaleidoscope of memory and dread. Every mile marker, every curve in the road brought with it a fresh wave of panic, a visceral reminder of the horror that awaited us at the end of our path. I gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, my eyes fixed on the asphalt ahead as if it might offer some respite from the churning maelstrom of my thoughts. Beside me, my companions sat in tense silence, each lost in their own dark musings. We'd planned and prepared as best we could. We had armed ourselves with every scrap of knowledge and arcane lore we could unearth. But in the face of the unknown, the unknowable, it all felt so woefully inadequate, like children playing at being heroes in the face of a very real monster. As we drew closer to the park, the sky seemed to darken, the shadows lengthened, as if in anticipation of our arrival. The air grew thick and heavy, weighed down by a palpable sense of menace that set my teeth on edge and made my skin crawl. By the time we reached the gates, night had fallen in earnest, a moonless, starless void that seemed to press in from all sides. We sat for a long moment in the darkness. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, each of us wrestling with our own private demons. I thought of turning back, of abandoning this mad quest and fleeing back to the safety of the city. But I know it was a false hope, a siren song of cowardice that would only lead to more suffering, more death. The creature would not stop, would not rest until it had glutted itself on the flesh and fear of the innocent. And so, with a deep breath and a muttered prayer, I reached for the door handle, felt the cold metal bite into my palm as I stepped out into the waiting darkness. My companions followed suit, the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. We gathered our gear from the trunk, checked and double-checked our weapons and wards. The weight of the shotgun in my hands was a cold comfort, a tangible reminder that we were not entirely defenseless against the horrors that lurked ahead. But as we set out into the woods following the narrow beam of our flashlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking willingly into the jaws of some great and terrible beast, that our fates had been sealed. The moment we crossed the threshold of the park, the forest closed in around us, a wall of shadow and rustling leaves that seemed to pulse with a malevolent intelligence. Every snapping twig, every flicker of movement in the underbrush sent a jolt of icy fear down my spine, my finger tightening reflexively on the trigger of my gun. We moved slowly, cautiously, scanning the darkness for any sign of our quarry. But the creature was a master of stealth, a shadow among shadows that seemed to be at the edges of our vision, always just out of reach. Hours passed in tense, sweaty silence, our nerves frayed with each passing minute. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the suffocating sense of being watched, hunted by something that knew these woods far better than any mere human ever could. And on just when I thought I could bear the tension no longer, we found it, or rather it found us. It came in a flurry of movement, a rush of displaced air, the crashing of underbrush. One moment the woods were still and silent, the next they erupted in a maelstrom of snarls and screams. I caught only a glimpse of it in the jerky, panicked sweep of my flashlight beam, a hulking shape, all corded muscle and matted fur, hunched and prowling on the edge of darkness. Eyes that glowed with feral, predatory intelligence fixed on us with a hunger that went beyond mere animal instinct. And that it was on us, a whirlwind of claws and teeth and fetid breath. I heard the sharp crack of a gun and felt the searing heat of a bullet passing close by my head. But the creature seemed to shrug off the assault, its hide too thick, its fury too great to be stopped by mere human weaponry. I saw one of my companions go down, heard the wet, meaty thud of his body hitting the forest floor. Another fell back screaming, his arm hanging limp and bloody at his side. Then it was just me, alone in the darkness. My gun clicked, empty and useless in my shaking hands. The creature leaned over me, its bolt blotting out the feeble light of my fallen flashlight. I could smell the stench of its breath, the rank odor of old blood and decay. And in that moment I knew with a cold, sinking certainty that I was going to die, that my quest had been a foolish, futile gesture in the face of an implacable, unknowable evil. But even as I braced myself for the killing blow, something strange happened. The creature hesitated, its head cocking to one side as if listening to some unheard voice. And in that moment of stillness, I saw something flicker in the depths of those glowing eyes. Something that almost looked like recognition. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that same feral hunger. But it was enough. A tiny spark of hope in the crushing darkness of my despair. As the creature lunged forward, its jaws gaping wide, I acted on pure instinct, my hand darting to the pouch at my belt and withdrawing the last desperate gambit I had prepared. The creature's teeth closed around my arm, a white, hot agony that tore a scream from my throat. But even as I felt the bone snap, the flesh tearing, I brought my other hand up, clutching tight in my blood-slicked fingers a vial of clear liquid. I jammed the vial into the creature's maw, felt the glass shatter against the roof of its mouth, and then, with a final convulsive effort, I squeezed, sending a jet of blessed water cascading down the monster's throat. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The creature reared back, a high, keening wail tearing from its throat, smoke billowed from its jaws, its eyes rolling back in its head as it thrashed and convulsed in apparent agony. I scrambled back, cradling my ruined arm against my chest, watching in mute horror as the creature's form began to shift and change its outline, blurring and warping like a heat haze on a summer road. And then, with a final shuddering gasp, it collapsed. Its body dissolved into a puddle of foul-smelling Ichor that sizzled and steamed on the forest floor. I don't remember much of what happened next. I have vague memories of stumbling through the woods, of the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, the babble of voices asking questions I couldn't begin to answer. I learned later that my companions had survived, though they would bear the scars, both physical and mental, for the rest of their lives. As for me, I spent weeks in the hospital, my body and mind ravaged by the horrors I had endured. But even as I lay there drifting on a sea of painkillers and post-traumatic shock, I knew that it was over. The creature was gone, banished back to whatever dark realm had spawned it. The cycle of death and terror had been broken, at least for now. And yet, as I stared up at the sterile white ceiling of my hospital room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. That somewhere out there in the deep dark places of the world other horrors lurked, waiting to be unleashed upon. Now unsuspecting, I had gazed into the abyss and it had gazed back. And though I had emerged victorious, I knew I would bear the scars of that encounter for the rest of my days. For once, you have seen the true face of evil. There can be no unseeing it, no return to the blissful ignorance of before. I was a changed man, forged in the fires of nightmares made real, and as I lay there, hovering on the knife's edge between waking and dreaming, I made a silent vow that for as long as I drew breath, I would be a guardian against the darkness, a lone candle flickering in the face of the endless night. For I learned the hard way that monsters are real and that sometimes the only thing standing between them and the innocent is one damaged, determined human, armed with knowledge, courage, and a willingness to stare unblinking into the face of terror itself. It was a heavy burden, a grim responsibility, but it was one I would shoulder gladly for the rest of my days. For in the end, it was the only way I knew to honor the memory of those who had fallen, the only way to ensure that their deaths had not been in vain. And so, as I closed my eyes and let the healing darkness take me, I whispered a final fervent promise into the waiting silence. Never again. I said never again, and in that moment I knew that, no matter what horrors the future might hold, I would be ready, for I was Owen Reed, monster hunter, and my watch had only just begun. Recovery was a slow and arduous process, both physically and mentally. The wounds I had sustained in my battle with the creature were severe. The scars they left behind were a stark and constant reminder of the horrors I had endured. But it was the mental scars that ran deepest, the invisible wounds that ached and throbbed. In the dark, quiet hours of the night, I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echoes of inhuman screams still ringing in my ears. The therapists and counselors did their best, offering me platitudes and coping strategies, pills to dull the edge of my terror. But they couldn't understand, not really. How could they, when the true nature of what I had faced was so far beyond the ken of ordinary human experience? And so I learned to cope in my own way, to channel my fear and my trauma into a grim, unwavering resolve. I threw myself into my new calling with a fervor that bordered on obsession, devouring every scrap of lore and legend I could get my hands on, honing my body and my mind into weapons against the darkness. I learned the ways of the hunter, the signs and wards that could hold the nightmares at bay. I studied the weaknesses of 100 different monsters, the ancient, half-forgotten methods of banishing them back to the pits that spawned them. And all the while I wrestled with the question that had haunted me since that fateful night in the woods. What I had seen in the creature's eyes in that fleeting moment before the end, recognition. As if, on some deep, primal level, the beast had known me, had sensed in me a kindred spirit. A fellow predator in the dark and savage world we inhabited. It was a thought that chilled me to my core, that made me question the very nature of my humanity. But what did it say about me? That some part of me resonated with the monsters I had sworn to destroy. Though I pushed those doubts aside, buried them deep in the recesses of my mind. I had a mission now, a purpose that went beyond mere survival or self-discovery. I was a guardian, a protector of the innocent, a lone bulwark against the tide of horrors that threatened to engulf the world. And so I threw myself into my work, taking on any case, no matter how strange or dangerous. I traveled the country, following the trail of blood and terror wherever it led, from the haunted backwoods of the Deep South to the mist-shrouded streets of New England. I faced demons and monsters of every shape and description, from the grotesque and misshapen to the beguiling and seductive. I learned that evil wore many faces, and that sometimes the most dangerous horrors were those that hid behind a mask of beauty and innocence. There were times when I questioned my sanity, when the weight of the horrors I had witnessed threatened to crush me beneath their unbearable bulk. Moments when I stared into the abyss of my own soul and saw there a darkness to rival any monster I had faced. But always I pulled myself back from that brink, anchoring myself to my mission, my purpose. I couldn't afford to lose myself in introspection or self-doubt, not when there were lives on the line, innocence to protect. And so I soldiered on alone, a wanderer on the highways and byways of the weird and the uncanny. I fought my battles in the shadows, waging war in the spaces between the ticks of the clock. I made allies where I could, fellow travelers on the edges of the unknown, mystics and mediums, occultists and diabolists, men and women who had gazed behind the curtain of reality and seen there the churning chaos that lurked beneath. Together we pulled our knowledge, our resources, we built a network of informants and agents, eyes and ears in every corner of the country. And bit by bit, case by case, we pushed back against the darkness, beating it back to the fetid corners from whence it had crawled. It was a thankless task, a never-ending battle against an enemy that knew neither pity nor remorse. But it was a battle I had sworn to fight, a duty I had taken upon myself, for I knew now with a certainty that went bone deep that this was my calling, that all the pain and trauma and horror I had endured had been for a purpose. I was Owen Reed, monster hunter, and as long as I drew breath, I would stand as a bulwark against the darkness. the guardian at the gates of the abyss. It was a lonely path, a road that could only end in blood and heartbreak. But it was the path I had chosen, the only one I could see. And so I walked it, head held high, my ever-present shotgun, a comforting weight in my hands, waiting for the next case, the next battle, knowing that somewhere out there in the dark and forgotten places of the world, the monsters were waiting too, waiting for me. As the eyes passed and the scars multiplied, I began to gain a reputation in certain circles. Among the loose network of hunters, mystics, and occultists who moved in the shadows of the paranormal world, the name Owen Reed became synonymous with a certain kind of grim determination, a relentless pursuit of the monstrous and the uncanny. They came to me with their cases, their pleas for help. Desperate souls at the end of their rope, their lives or sanity threatened by forces beyond their comprehension. And I took them on, one by one, a never-ending parade of horrors and heartbreak. There was the young widow in Louisiana, haunted by the vengeful spirit of her abusive husband. The teenage runaway in Oregon, stalked by a predatory shapeshifter that wore the faces of her deepest desire. The old man in Massachusetts, his mind and body slowly consumed by a parasitic entity from beyond the stars. Each case was different, each monster unique in its own terrible way, but the core of the work remained the same: identify the threat, learn its weaknesses, and then confront it head-on with all the knowledge, courage, and sheer stubborn will I could muster. It was a grueling existence, a life lived on the knife's edge between the mundane and the monstrous. My days were filled with research and reconnaissance, poring over ancient tomes and tracking down esoteric artifacts. My nights were spent in stakeouts and ambushes, laying traps for creatures that defied the laws of nature and sanity. I lost count of the close calls, the near misses, and last-minute escapes. The times piled up. I stumbled back to my lonely motel room, bleeding and battered, my mind reeling from the horrors I had witnessed. But always I pushed myself back to my feet, patched my wounds, and reloaded my weapons. Because I knew that if I didn't, if I allowed myself a moment's weakness or hesitation, then more innocent lives would be lost. More souls consumed by the ravening dark. It was a heavy burden, a crushing responsibility, and there were moments when I felt the weight of it keenly, when the years of trauma and isolation threatened to pull me under into a sea of despair and madness. But always I found the strength to carry on, to take on the next case and the next, because in the end it was the only thing that made sense to me anymore, the only path I could see through the labyrinth of my fractured psyche. As a hunter, a stalker of the strange and the deadly, it was what I had been made for, forged in the crucible of that first terrible encounter in the Shenandoah wilds. And so I pressed on, my resolve hardening with each passing year. Each new notch on my belt of monstrous trophies, I became a fixture in the shadowy underworld of the paranormal, my name spoken in whispers and my counsel sought by those who walked a thin line between the light and the dark. But for all my reputation, all my hard-won experience, there was one case that continued to haunt me, one mystery that I could never seem to unravel no matter how many years I put behind me. The mystery of the thing in the woods, the creature that had nearly ended me on that fateful night so long ago. The mystery of what I had seen in its eyes in that final terrible moment. A flicker of recognition of kinship. It gnawed at me in the quiet hours, a splinter in my mind that I could never quite dig out. I had faced 100 horrors since that night had sent scores of monsters howling back to the pits that spawned them. But always in the back of my mind the question lingered. What was it about that creature, that particular avatar of hunger and savagery that had resonated so deeply with some dark buried part of my own soul? I told myself it didn't matter that the beast was long dead and the case closed, that I had more pressing concerns, more immediate threats to confront. But still the question haunted me, a riddle I couldn't unravel. And deep down in a place I rarely allowed myself to acknowledge, I knew that I would never truly be free of it, that somewhere out there in the tangled wilds of the Shenandoah the answers waited. Answers that might shed light on the deepest, darkest corners of my own fractured psyche. Answers that I both longed for and dreaded with equal measure. And so, even as I threw myself into my work, even as I built my reputation as one of the foremost monster hunters in the country, I knew that one day I would have to return, would have to confront the mystery that had birthed me, the question that had haunted me for so long. One day, I would have to go back to where it all began, to face my demons in the place of their birth. It was a reckoning long overdue, and though the thought of it filled me with a bone-deep dread, I knew I could not run from it forever. The decision to return to Shenandoah, to confront the ghosts of my past and the mystery that had haunted me for so long, did not come easily. For years I had pushed the idea away, buried it deep beneath the never-ending demands of my work, the constant stream of horrors that required my attention. But as time wore on and the question continued to fester like a splinter in my mind, I began to realize that I could not outrun it forever, that sooner or later I would have to turn and face the darkness that had birthed me, the trauma that had forged me into the man I had become. And so, on a crisp autumn morning, I found myself once again at the gates of Shenandoah National Park, my battered truck loaded down with the tools of my trade. The leaves were just beginning to turn in the forest, a riot of reds and golds that stood in stark contrast to the leaden sky above. It was a sight that should have filled me with peace, with a sense of the beauty and majesty of the natural world. But all I could feel was a growing sense of unease, a prickling at the back of my neck that spoke of dark things lurking just beyond the veil of the mundane. I had told no one of my plans, had left no word of my destination or intent. In part, this was a precaution, a hedge against the possibility of innocent lives being caught in the crossfire of whatever confrontation lay ahead. But if I was being honest with myself, it was also a reflection of the deep abiding loneliness that had become my constant companion over the long years of my strange crusade. The simple, unvarnished truth was that I had no one to tell, no loved ones to bid farewell or worry about after my safety. I was a man alone, a solitary figure standing against the tide of darkness. And though there was a certain grim pride in that fact, a sense of purpose and destiny, there was also an aching emptiness, a void that could never quite be filled, a yearning for connection, for understanding that went beyond the shallow camaraderie of my fellow hunters and mystics. But I pushed those thoughts aside as I shouldered my pack and set off into the woods, my senses keenly attuned to the slightest hint of danger or strangeness. I had a job to do, mystery to unravel, and I could not afford to be distracted by self-pity or regret. The hike to the site of that long-ago confrontation was a grueling one, a test of both my physical endurance and mental fortitude. With each step, each rustling of leaves beneath my boots, memories came flooding back. Vivid and visceral, the terror of that night, the searing pain of the creature's teeth sinking into my flesh, the sick, slick feel of its hide beneath my hands as I struggled to break free. And throughout all, there was that haunting flicker of recognition in its eyes, that sense of kinship and understanding that I had never been able to shake. By the time I reached the small, sheltered hollow where the final battle had taken place, my heart was pounding and my breath coming in ragged gasps. The years had done little to erase the signs of that titanic struggle, the shattered trees, the gouged earth, the faint, lingering stench of corruption that hung in the air like a miasma. But it was the silence that struck me most keenly, the utter absence of birdsong or insect chatter that seemed to press in on me from all sides. It was as if the very forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what fresh horror might be born from this cursed ground. For a long moment I simply stood there, my eyes closed and my fists clenched at my sides, reaching out with every fiber of my being, every shred of occult knowledge and preternatural awareness, searching for any hint of the creature's presence, any sign that my long years of searching had finally come to an end. But there was nothing No flicker of eldritch energy, no whisper of malevolent intelligence lurking just beyond the veil. Just the heavy, expectant silence of the forest and the weight of my own tangled emotions pressing down on me like a physical force. And then, just as I was about to turn away to admit defeat and begin the long, lonely trek back to my truck, I heard it. A sound that froze the blood in my veins and sent a spike of pure animal terror racing down my spine, a low, guttural growl rising from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. A sound that was at once intimately familiar and utterly alien, filled with a hunger and a malice that defied all human understanding. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I turned to face the source of that awful sound. And there, emerging from the darkness like a nightmare made flesh, was it. I saw the creature that had haunted my dreams and waking thoughts for so long, the beast that had nearly ended my life and set me on the path of the hunter. But it was changed, twisted in ways that I could barely begin to comprehend. Its form was fluid, shifting, their constantly mutating mass of teeth and claws and pulsing, cancerous flesh. And its eyes? Its eyes were no longer those of a mere predator, a simple creature of instinct and appetite. No, what stared back at me from those hellish orbs was a vast abyssal intelligence, an ancient and malevolent awareness that had looked upon the face of madness itself and found it wanting. In that moment, I knew I had been wrong. I had underestimated the true nature of the horror I had faced so long ago. This was no mere monster, no simple beast to be slain and forgotten. This was something older, darker, a manifestation of primal chaos that lurked at the heart of all things, a force of pure, unreasoning evil given form and purpose by some blasphemous alchemy of the cosmos. And it had been waiting for me all these long years, waiting for the moment when I would return, when I would offer myself up as a vessel for its dark and terrible will. I felt a scream building in my throat, primal animal howl of terror and despair. But before I could give voice to that awful sound, the creature spoke its voice, a sepulchral whisper that echoed in the depths of my mind, bypassing the crude medium of the physical senses. "Welcome home," it said, its tone thick with a perverse mocking affection. "We've so much to discuss, you and I." And with those words, with that simple, awful acknowledgement of the bond between us, I knew that my long hunt had finally come to an end and that the true horror was only just beginning. In the face of that towering eldritch horror, a manifestation of pure primal evil, I felt my hard-won composure begin to crack. My iron will began to buckle. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to flee this cursed place and never look back. But I knew that such an act would be futile, a mere postponement of the inevitable. The creature had marked me, had forged a bond between us that could not be broken by mere distance or denial. And so, with a supreme effort of will, I stood my ground, my hand hovering over the butt of my trusty shotgun, even as I met the creature's hellish gaze with my own. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice thin and reedy to my own ears. "Why have you been haunting me all these years?" The creature laughed, a sound like the grinding of tombstones, the shattering of ancient bones. "Oh, my dear foolish child," it said, its tongue dripping with condescension. "You still don't understand, do you? Even after all this time, all the horrors you've witnessed?" It took a step forward, its form shifting and flowing like quicksilver, a kaleidoscope of nightmarish shapes and textures. "I have not been haunting you," it said in a voice that was a purring whisper in my mind. "I have been guiding you, shaping you, preparing you for your true purpose." I shook my head, a denial, a refusal to accept the awful implications of the creature's words. "No," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and revulsion. "No, I am a hunter, a defender of the innocent. I am not. I cannot be what you claim." Again, that awful grating laughter scraped at the inside of my skull like rusted nails. "Poor deluded boy," the creature said, its tone almost pitying. You still cling to your illusions of morality and purpose, still believe that your actions have been your own. It lunged in close. Its breath was a fetid wind against my face, its eyes twin pits of swirling madness. Everything you have done, every choice you have made has been in service to me, it hissed. Every monster slain, every soul saved, all of it leading you inexorably to this moment, to your true destiny. I wanted to deny it, to scream my defiance and unload my shotgun into the creature's twisted face. But deep down in a place I had long sought to ignore, to bury beneath a mountain of grim determination and self-delusion, I knew that it was true. I knew that it was true. I knew that every step of my long, tortured journey had been orchestrated, every trial and trauma carefully designed to mold me into the perfect vessel for the creature's dark designs. And with that realization came a wave of despair, a soul-crushing sense of hopelessness and futility. For what chance did I, a mere mortal man, have against a force of such ancient and primal malevolence? What hope could there be in the face of a power that had guided the very course of my life, that had shaped me like clay upon a potter's wheel? But even as I felt myself sinking into that abyss of hopelessness, even as I teetered on the brink of surrender and madness, something deep within me, some last defiant spark of my soul, refused to be extinguished. A lifetime of pain and struggle, of standing against the darkness, had forged in me a core of adamantine will, unbreakable and unyielding. There was this core that rose up now in the face of the creature's awful revelations, to assert itself one last time. No, I said my voice, a low, steady growl filled with a resolve I had never known myself capable of. I am not your pawn, your plaything to be twisted to your own ends. I am Owen Reed, monster hunter, and I choose my own path. The creature recoiled as if struck. Its form rippled with shock and fury. Foolish, stubborn child, it hissed. That's very Sylvanas whipped in my mind. You cannot escape your destiny, cannot defy the role that has been ordained for you. But I stood firm, my shotgun leveled at the creature's heart, my finger tightening on the trigger. I have spent my entire life defying the odds, I said, my voice ringing with conviction, standing against horrors that would break the minds and spirits of lesser men. And I will not fall now, not to you or any other force of evil. With those words I opened fire, the roar of the shotgun thundering through the forest like the wrath of an avenging god. The creature screamed a high, keening wail of rage and pain as the blessed silver rounds tore through its shifting protean flesh. But it did not fall. Instead, it seemed to swell, to grow, its form expanding to towering heights, its eyes blazing with a mad, malevolent power. So be it, it growled, its voice a rumbling earthquake that shook the very earth beneath my feet. If you will not embrace your destiny, then you will be destroyed by it. With those words it lunged, a tidal wave of claws and teeth and writhing eldritch horror. I leapt aside, my reflexes honed by years of desperate battle, and brought my gun to bear once more. What followed was a battle unlike any I had ever known. A desperate, brutal struggle against an enemy that seemed to defy all laws of nature and reason. The creature was fast, strong, its hide resistant to even the most potent of my mystical armaments. And it possessed an awful, uncanny intelligence, anticipating my every move, countering my every strategy. But I was fueled by something more than mere skill or weaponry. I was driven by the unquenchable fire of my own will, my determination to assert my agency, my humanity in the face of an implacable, inhuman evil. And it was this fire that sustained me, that kept me on my feet and fighting even as my body was battered and my mind pushed to the very brink of madness. In the end, it was not my shotgun or my silver blades that won the day. It was my sheer, stubborn refusal to surrender, to accept the dark fate that had been ordained for me. With a final, desperate lunge, I plunged my hand into the creature's gaping maw, my fingers closing around the pulsing, cancerous mass that passed for its heart, and with a scream of defiance and triumph, I tore it free. The creature's body convulsing and dissolving around me like a nightmare vanished by the first light of dawn. I stood there, panting, blood-soaked, as the last echoes of the creature's death throes faded into silence. I had done it. I had faced my greatest fear, my darkest demon, and I had emerged victorious. But as I stood there, as the adrenaline and battle fever slowly faded, I realized that my trials were far from over. The creature was gone, banished back to whatever dark realm spawned it. The scars it left upon my soul would linger forever. I had gazed into the abyss, seen the very face of evil, and recognized it as my own. The creature's words, its awful revelations, would haunt me for the rest of my days. A constant reminder of how close I came to succumbing to the darkness, to becoming the very thing I swore to destroy. But I also knew that I had a choice, a chance to forge my own path, to use my hard-won knowledge and experience to make a real difference in the world. I was a hunter, a guardian against things that lurked in the shadows, and that was a calling I would not abandon. And so, with a heavy heart and a soul forever marked by my ordeals, I turned my back on that cursed glade, that dark birthing place of horrors. I knew I would never be free of the scars. I bore the memories that haunted every waking moment. But I also knew that I had the strength to carry on, to keep fighting the good fight for as long as I drew breath. I was Owen Reed, Monster Hunter. My watch was far from over. As I walked away from that place of nightmares, I couldn't help but reflect on the long, twisted path that led me to this moment. Every hardship I endured, every horror I faced had been a crucible forging me into the man I am today. I thought of all the lives I touched, the souls I saved from the hungry dark. I thought of the bonds I had forged, the friendships and alliances that had sustained me through the long, lonely years of my crusade. And I realized that, for all the pain and trauma I had suffered, I was grateful for the journey that had brought me here, because it had shown me the true measure of my strength, the unbreakable core of will and purpose that defined me. I knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, that there would always be new monsters to face, new nightmares to confront. But I also knew that I would not have to walk that road alone, for I had my wits, my weapons, and my unshakable resolve. And I had the knowledge, hard-won and blood-bought, that even in the darkest of nights there was always a light to guide the way. As I emerged from the forest, the sun breaking through the clouds to bathe me in its warmth, I felt a sense of peace, of purpose settle over me. I had faced my demons and emerged